Dawn spread over Safe Zone 13, casting a cold gray light over the ruins of Seoul. Towering apartment blocks loomed behind layers of concrete, steel, and razor wire, while drone floodlights swept the walls. Above the skyline, a purple fracture shimmered in the sky like an unhealing wound. Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance. Digital billboards flashed warnings about elevated dungeon activity, mandatory reincarnation registry reporting, and the Safe Zone's population of over 3 million. On the outer wall, hunters trained openly before the civilians below. A mage hurled fire from her palm, and a lancer split a steel dummy in half. People stopped to watch with open admiration. In this world, power was spectacle and weakness meant death. Inside the Reincarnation Management Center, the registration hall was filled with glass screens, metal benches, and a tense silence. Newly awakened reincarnates sat clutching numbered tablets. Some prayed, some cried, and some stared blankly ahead. Kong Min-jae sat among them, 27 years old, dressed plainly, his hands rough with old calluses. He kept his eyes on the polished floor as broken memories flashed through him. Collapsing rebar, screaming steel cables, a twisting bridge deck, dark water below, and his hand reaching for nothing. He inhaled sharply. Kong Min-jae had awakened in a new body. He was alive, but not in the life he remembered. A transparent screen hovered before him, displaying his name, status as a reincarnated survivor, memory integration progress, and a pending class assignment. One by one, names were called. Each candidate stepped into the assessment circle, and each result drew gasps or cheers. A candidate acquired the Spear Saint class, earning applause. Another became a flame mage, drawing more cheers. Then a shadow assassin was announced, prompting a woman near Kong Min-jae to laugh shakily in relief, saying at least it was something useful. Kong Min-jae lowered his eyes. In his old life, useful meant load calculations, reinforcement schedules, and evacuation routes. No one applauded the engineer. They only remembered him when something failed. His number flashed. Kong Min-jae stood and stepped into the assessment circle. White lines spun around his boots, and above him, a crystal lens unfolded like a mechanical flower. The reincarnation AI announced his reincarnation sync was stable and detected mana channels, beginning class determination. Light swallowed him. For one impossible second, Kong Min-jae did not see brightness but structure, stress lines in the platform, bolt distribution in the overhead frame, hairline fatigue in a support beam to the east. Then the result appeared. Silence fell. His class was engineering. No grand title, no saint or master, just one plain word. The hall laughed. The recruit officer blinked in surprise and questioned the assignment. Another officer checked his tablet and noted that support production types rarely appeared on First Awakening. A trainee snorted, dismissing it as not even a real dungeon class. A mocking voice rose from the back, questioning if the registry was handing out construction workers now. Kong Min-jae turned to see Park Ji-yoon standing there in an expensive combat coat with a captain insignia. Beside him leaned Seo Yuna, an assault hunter from the training feeds, arms crossed and expression unreadable. Seo Yuna glanced at Kong Min-jae's status window and raised an eyebrow, commenting that engineering during a wave cycle was cruel. Her tone was factual, neither pity nor contempt, which hurt more. The recruit officer's tone turned flat and procedural, explaining that engineering class awakeners were generally assigned to logistics, repair, municipal reinforcement, and rear-line labor assistance, with combat deployment not recommended. A teenager nearby laughed, mocking that if monsters broke through, Kong Min-jae could file a maintenance request. More laughter followed. Kong Min-jae said nothing. His status updated with primary ability, structural analysis, secondary ability, blueprint manifestation, tertiary ability, material efficiency conversion. The officers barely looked. No attack skills, no weapon affinity, no flashy mana output. Worthless by every visible standard. Park Ji-yoon smirked and suggested sending Kong Min-jae to wall patching, implying he might die holding a wrench. A few hunters grinned. Seo Yuna pushed off the pillar and walked closer, studying Kong Min-jae as if deciding whether he was pathetic or merely irrelevant. She asked if he could fight. Kong Min-jae met her gaze and admitted not in the way she meant. Seo Yuna told him to stay out of hunter lanes and turned away, dismissing him completely. The recruit officer gestured toward the side corridor and instructed Kong Min-jae to proceed to vocational integration. The next candidate's beam of light descended before Kong Min-jae had even stepped off the platform, as if he had already stopped existing. The corridor beyond the hall was narrow and dim, stripped of public spectacle. Kong Min-jae stopped at a reinforced window overlooking the outer district. Workers welded steel plates onto an old maglev support while concrete mixers rolled under armed escort. On a distant screen, a news anchor reported rising casualties in the Busan sector, but officials maintained the next large-scale wave could still be contained. Kong Min-jae pressed a hand to the glass, and the world shifted in his perception. Support columns outside bloomed with invisible vectors, weight paths, torsion loads, failure probabilities, vehicle choke points, sightline gaps, and resonance risks if an ogre-class creature struck the third gate repeatedly. His breathing slowed as he saw not objects but systems. The safe zone was not a city ready but an unfinished design under siege. A voice spoke behind him, noting the interesting expression for someone just declared useless. Kong Min-jae turned to see Professor Chimera standing there in a field jacket over a lab coat, carrying a stack of data slates. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were sharp. Professor Chimera glanced at his status readout and explained that engineering was rare, extremely unpopular, and statistically underreported because most died before anyone learned what the class could do. Kong Min-jae looked at her sharply when she said can do. She explained that most awakened saw mana as force, fire, ice, blades. Some saw flow. Very few saw structure. He looked back through the glass, where cracks in the wall almost seemed to glow. He pointed to a distant junction where old concrete met newer manalloy reinforcement, explaining the different expansion behavior and bad load transition. If something hit it hard enough, the shock would not disperse but stack, causing the corner to shear after 3 or 4 impacts. Professor Chimera stared at him fully, surprised he saw that from there. Kong Min-jae did not answer immediately. In his mind, he saw the bridge from his first life, the one that had failed, the one he had not saved. Steel did not forgive arrogance. Neither did walls. Outside, another siren began, louder than before. The purple fracture over the city pulsed twice. Every screen in the corridor flashed red with warnings of a black maw dungeon activity surge and orders for all personnel to ready stations. People froze, then broke into motion. Combat classes ran toward glory, support staff toward shelters. Kong Min-jae stayed at the window one heartbeat longer, staring at the city like a blueprint built too fast and trusted too much. Mocked, discarded, sent to the rear, his hands slowly curled into fists. In his first life, things had collapsed because people believed strength was enough. They only noticed structure after it broke. Beside him, his class window flickered. Kong Min-jae stared at it, jaw tightening. For the first time since waking in this world, he did not feel shame. He felt certainty. The government training hall in Safe Zone A13 was built for spectacle. Concrete walls bore impact scars and blackened burns from magic tests. Steel dummies stood in rows under white floodlights. Behind high observation windows, officials and trainees watched the arena floor like a stage. On one side, combat classes drew attention effortlessly. A berserker split a titanium target in half. A lightning lancer crossed the room in a blue flash. Applause followed every display. At the far end, beyond yellow hazard lines and a stack of unused maintenance crates, Kong Min-jae stood alone. No applause, no audience. Just a tablet, a toolbox, and a board evaluator. A title glowed on the monitor beside him. Class verification test, non-combat/support. Kong Min-jae stared at it as if it were an insult. Above the arena railing, Park Do-yoon leaned with his squad, openly amused. Park Do-yoon mocked Kong Min-jae, questioning what the so-called legendary engineer could do, implying he might just complain to the monsters. Laughter followed his remark. Nearby, Seo Yuna adjusted her gauntlets and noted practically that if Min-jae could reinforce a wall before it broke, that was already more useful than panicking. Kong Min-jae exhaled and gripped his tablet tighter as the system window hovered before him, displaying his engineering class skills: structural analysis, blueprint manifestation, and material efficiency conversion. He had spent the entire night replaying his awakening, the strange second sight that revealed hidden truths beneath surfaces, cracks inside concrete, weak bolts under strain, and trembling gate joints. If that vision was real, then his class was not mere support but a way of seeing the battlefield itself. The evaluator called for Subject Kong Min-jae to begin the standard interface test by analyzing Target Dummy 3. A steel combat dummy rolled into the center lane, and Min-jae stepped forward. As he focused, the dummy's shell turned translucent, revealing stress lines in red at the left knee, yellow through the neck column, and blue density mapping over the torso plate. Tiny white glyphs pulsed where mana had been infused for durability. Min-jae recognized pale currents of mana threading through the metal like luminous veins, pooling in the chest core and thinning toward the limbs. A complete diagram formed in his mind: load paths, material composition, resonance loss, and failure sequence. He identified the dummy as having a carbon steel frame, a ceramic composite chestplate, and a mana reinforcement node in the sternum housing. He noted inefficient circulation with a 32% flow drop at the right shoulder coupling. The evaluator was surprised that Min-jae could perceive such details, but Min-jae clarified that he did not just see them, he understood them. Murmurs spread through the observation area as Professor Chimera entered and stopped, watching intently. Park Do-yoon scoffed, dismissing the analysis as guesswork. The evaluator instructed Min-jae to mark predicted break zones. A projection stylus appeared in Min-jae's hand, and he circled the knee, sternum, and lower cervical brace. He explained that a sword strike on the plate would be resisted, a lancer's pierce would disperse mana, but a force redirected from below at the knee would cause the dummy to collapse and expose the core in under 2 seconds. Do-yoon laughed, claiming Min-jae had just described tripping the dummy, but Min-jae insisted he had described dismantling it. The evaluator signaled a staff hunter forward with a combat hammer to strike the marked points. The first strike at the knee caused the leg to buckle exactly along Min-jae's Min-jae's line. The second strike at the neck brace twisted the upper frame. The third strike at the sternum burst the chest core in sparks, and the dummy collapsed. Silence followed, then surprise rippled through the hall. Do-yoon's smile faded, and Professor Chai leaned closer to the glass. She ordered an increase in test complexity. A modular defense wall was wheeled into the advanced lane. It stood 3 meters high, layered with steel and concrete, threaded with mana mesh, designed to withstand direct assault. Min-jae studied it and nearly staggered. The wall revealed itself as a cathedral of forces. Compression stacked in center braces, tension dragged through anchor bolts, microfractures hid beneath recent repairs, and mana flowed unevenly through conductive lattice channels. He saw where the wall was strong and, more importantly, where it was lying. Every built structure carried its own confession. The evaluator asked if Min-jae's class could improve the barrier's durability. Do-yoon muttered sarcastically about asking the janitor to save the fortress, but Min-jae ignored him. He circled the wall, tracking hidden lines, then raised a hand. A translucent blue sheet unfolded in the air, a blueprint. Gasps spread as it rotated beside the real wall, mirroring every layer. Bolts, braces, fill, mana channels. Red marks bloomed across the projection. Min-jae pointed out that the reinforcement layout was wrong. The load transfer from the impact plates was delayed because the mana mesh and physical bracing were misaligned. Two good systems interfered with each other. Professor Chai asked if he could fix it. Min-jae crouched by a crate of spare materials, steel wedges, anchor pins, low-grade mana cable, and construction resin. When he touched them, information flooded in: density, purity, flex behavior, conductivity. One cable was better than labeled, one pin had internal fatigue, and one resin would amplify mana if spread thin instead of thick. His class was not just analysis but selection and optimization. He moved quickly, certainty growing with every step. He angled wedges into lower joints, rerouted mana cable across side braces, and spread resin in a narrow seam instead of a broad patch. System text flickered, indicating material efficiency conversion activation. The cable glowed brighter than expected, and the resin hardened into a glassy blue seam. The blueprint updated in real time overhead. Min-jae explained that now impact force traveled down and outward instead of stalling at the center, with mana flow following the same path. The material did not need to increase. It needed to agree with itself. The evaluator blinked and ordered a live breach test. Alarm lights flashed yellow as a combat automaton rolled into place opposite the wall, its arm fitted with a hydraulic ram. ShadowHeroManhwa turned fully toward Min-jae and warned him to stand back if the automaton failed. Min-jae remained still. The automaton charged and slammed its ram into the wall. Dust burst outward, and the structure shuddered violently but held. Data screens spiked, showing increased impact absorption, and the mana lattice flared blue instead of fragmenting. The evaluator ordered another strike. The automaton hit again. The unmodified sections beside the reinforced segment fractured first, with a side panel caving in. Min-jae's adjusted segment remained intact, vibrations dispersing in clean waves. No one laughed now. Do-yoon straightened, and Professor Che's eyes shone with approval. Min-jae stared at the wall, his heartbeat pounding. Being useful was not enough. He needed to be undeniable. Then his gaze lifted beyond the lane to the overhead maintenance gantry. One support bracket showed hairline fatigue. One more heavy shock would shear it loose. The automaton reset directly beneath it. Min-jae's eyes widened as he urgently called to stop the test. The evaluator frowned but hesitated. Min-jae insisted that the gantry support above lane 4 was about to fail. It was too late. The automaton lunged again. The ram struck and a metallic scream tore through the hall. The ceiling bracket snapped and a massive steel maintenance assembly dropped toward the lane, heading straight for 2 frozen technicians below. Chaos erupted. Hunters looked up, but the collapse was too sudden. Min-jae reacted first. The blueprint in his vision expanded across the entire lane, showing angles, trajectory, weight, and impact point. He seized a loose anchor cable and slammed its hook into a floor ring. Blueprint manifestation activated, projecting a glowing line in the air as a force guidance. Min-jae commanded ShadowHeroManhwa to cut at the marked point. She hesitated briefly, but then trusted him. She vanished in a silver blur. Her blade struck the exact stress point Min-jae had marked. The falling gantry split in two, its weight redirected along the glowing line. One half crashed harmlessly into the reinforced wall, and the other slammed into the floor just short of the technicians, showering sparks and dust. Silence fell heavier than the impact. The 2 technicians collapsed backward, alive. ShadowHeroManhwa landed lightly, staring at the severed steel and then at Min-jae. Above, Professor Chai gripped the railing tightly. Park Do-yoon said nothing. Min-jae stood in the settling dust, chest heaving as the blueprint faded from the air. For the first time since his awakening, the room regarded him as they did fighters, not as dead weight or mere support, but as someone dangerous. The outer wall of safe Zona 13 stretched across ruined Seoul like the spine of a giant beast. Floodlights swept over steel and concrete, and mana towers pulsed blue in steady intervals. To everyone else, else, the wall appeared unbreakable. To Kang Min-jae, it looked like a corpse still standing. From the maintenance catwalk halfway up Tower Segment 14, Min-jae stared at one section of the barrier until translucent lines bloomed across his vision, stress maps, fault webs, mana circulation routes, and buried foundation loads. The wall was not a wall but a fracture held together by habit and hope. A cold wind blew from the direction of the Black Maw dungeon. Professor Chai Mira climbed up behind Min-jae, carrying a tablet under one arm. She noted that he had been staring at the same section for 6 minutes. Min-jae explained that the situation worsened the longer he examined it. She stepped beside him as patrol hunters moved below like sparks and repair drones crawled over the wall. Beyond the wall, the ash-dark land around the dungeon mouth shifted under an unnatural fog. Chai Mira reminded Min-jae that they had reinforced the vulnerable junction at the center, which he had identified as weak. Min-jae countered that they had only reinforced the symptom. He crouched and pressed his palm to the metal deck, projecting a pale blue layered model showing the wall, pylons, underground braces, and mana conduits extending nearly 2 kilometers below. Sections of the projection flashed red, then more red, until entire load corridors turned black. Chai Mira's face drained as she realized the severity. The projection revealed pylons built in different eras, mismatched concrete from emergency repairs, mana relay lines threaded through old subway tunnels, and foundation anchors sunk into dungeon-corrupted soil. The problem was not a single flaw but a chain reaction waiting to happen. Chai Mira expressed disbelief at the numbers, saying that if resonance was that high, the barrier should already be unstable. Min-jae confirmed that it was unstable but held together by overcompensation. He expanded another layer showing uneven mana tower output through the wall, with bright veins beside dim dead patches. Min-jae explained that the city mistook the structure for a defense system, but it was actually 3 generations of emergency construction layered on top of each other: physical reinforcement, mana mesh, and reactive shielding. None of it was designed as a unified structure. Chai Mira called it a layered retrofit, while Min-jae described it as a layered contradiction. He pointed to a buried conduit rebuilt after the 3rd breach with lower-grade aggregate due to collapsing supply lines. 6 years later, mana lattice plating was added on top, creating a stronger surface but the same weak core. Western towers were tied into old subway power tunnels because it was faster than digging new channels. Min-jae looked up at the real wall, his jaw tightening, and noted that every major impact now bottlenecked instead of dispersing. Chai Mira identified these bottlenecks at the gates, and Min-jae added that the pylon feet and transit tunnels underneath were also vulnerable. If one failed, others would inherit the load. If 2 failed, the line would fold inward. Far below, a patrol horn sounded. Later, in the barrier command room of Safe Zone A13, the atmosphere was tense with screens, maps, live feeds, and officers reporting. Min-jae's projections spread across the central tactical table, silencing the room. Director Han Tae-sik stood at the head, broad-shouldered and sleepless. Seo Yuna waited off to one side in her black assault coat with crossed arms. Park Do-yoon leaned against a console, his skepticism evident. Director Han asked Min-jae to explain simply. Min-jae stated that the safe zone was not secure and only appeared so because the barrier had not yet been hit by the right kind of wave. Murmurs broke out. Do-yoon scoffed, reminding that the wall had survived 14 outbreak cycles. Min-jae responded that the dungeon had been testing them. Min-jae opened impact records, breach attempts, and mana fluctuation charts, explaining that Black Maw did not attack randomly but changed patterns after every failure, probing, recording, and adapting. Chai Mira added that they had observed variants in each wave but Command had treated it as natural mutation. Min-jae's model suggested directed adaptation by the dungeon core. Do-yoon expressed disbelief that a dungeon could adapt in this way. Min-jae overlaid past waves against the current barrier plan. The first wave involved brute shock creatures, the second, corrosive types at drainage sectors, the third, climbers targeting tower crews, the fourth, burrowers near utility routes. Together, these attacks formed a tightening pattern around the same weak infrastructure nodes. Director Han's expression hardened as he realized the dungeon was mapping them. Min-jae confirmed that the mapping was complete. He pointed to the northern sector and predicted that the next wave would not try to overpower the whole wall but would strike where force, mana, and logistics intersect, support tunnels, tower relays, and then the central gate when the load shifted. Seo Yuna uncrossed her arms and asked how long they had. Min-jae estimated less than 10 days if Black Maw was accelerating the cycle. The room erupted in disbelief. Some argued the forecast said 3 weeks. Min-jae countered that the forecast assumed normal escalation, but this was not normal. Do-yoon insisted that hunters would kill the wave before it reached the wall. Min-jae calmly replied that Do-yoon was planning for enemies attacking the front, while he was planning for enemies attacking the structure. No one answered. Director Han asked what would happen if the next wave came exactly as Min-jae predicted. Min-jae looked at the glowing line representing Safe Zone 13, with millions of lives behind the barrier. He stated that the outer wall would breach in under 17 minutes. A tablet slipped from someone's hand hand, and even Duyun fell silent. Min-jae continued before panic could spread, explaining that central evacuation arteries would jam, Tower 9 and Tower 11 would lose synchronization, and the mana shield would flicker. If the breach widened past 40 meters, civilians in sectors C through F would be directly exposed. He met Director Han's eyes and projected the casualty estimate as catastrophic. At night, Min-jae led a group underground through the outer barrier's north sublevel access. The group included Director Han, Seo Yuna, Chai Mira, 2 engineers, and a reluctant Duyun. The tunnel beneath the wall was damp and lined with old concrete, with conduit pipes humming along the ceiling and emergency lights flickering red. Min-jae stopped beside a support pier that looked solid to the others but appeared rotten to him. He placed his hand against it, projecting hidden cracks, voids, mana erosion, and rust blooming in the rebar. He explained that the pier was carrying 32% more load than its design tolerance. One engineer swallowed nervously, insisting that they had inspected the route last month. Min-jae clarified that the inspection had been visual only. He pointed upward, explaining that the mana mesh above had stiffened the superstructure, transferring flex down to the pier. Strengthening the top had forced weakness underground where no one was watching. Duyun frowned and asked if the pier could hold. Min-jae studied the conduit running through the pier, the old tunnel branching toward transit sectors, and a hairline fissure spreading where dungeon-tainted groundwater had seeped in. He concluded that it would not hold through the next wave. A vibration rolled through the tunnel. Everyone felt it. It was not an earthquake but a pulse. The lights flickered, and Chai Myra's tablet shrieked with alerts. She identified a mana pressure spike from Black Maw. Above them, sirens began to howl. Director Han's radio crackled violently with an emergency report from perimeter scouts about mass movement at the dungeon edge of unknown composition. The next morning in Safe Zone, a 13 skilled recruitment hall, a digital wall streamed contracts, hazard bonuses, and casualty clauses while hunters stood beneath glowing class signs like stars at an audition. Bright and violent classes such as Berserker, Lancer, Frostcaster, and Blade Dancer drew respect. At the end of the line stood Kong Min-jae, wearing a plain utility jacket and carrying a borrowed tablet under one arm. Dark circles under his eyes revealed another sleepless night underground. His status window hovered beside him, dull and unimpressive, showing his class as engineering. People tried not to stare but failed. An Iron Crest Guild recruiter scanned Min-jae's file without sitting and dismissed engineering as maintenance, stating they were hiring hunters. Min-jae caught the tablet before it hit the floor. At the next desk, a woman from White Fang Security tapped his record with a manicured nail, criticizing his lack of combat specialty, strike skill, and direct kill history. Min-jae pointed out that he had prevented an equipment collapse in Training B7. The recruiter replied that this made him useful to facilities, not raids, and suggested municipal repair instead. At a third desk, a captain from Thunder Axis laughed before Min-jae could finish introducing himself, mocking his class as one that built scaffolding. Nearby hunters snickered, joking that Min-jae might hammer nails at goblins or file blueprints at them. Laughter spread through the hall. Min-jae tightened his jaw but remained silent, having heard worse in 2 lives. The captain leaned back, stating that when a breach opened, people needed monsters dead in seconds, not someone measuring walls. Min-jae warned calmly that if the wall failed, the seconds available to respond would vanish. The captain responded with a smirk, implying that they should hope the wall held. Park Duyun then entered the room, his combat coat immaculate and the guild insignia bright on his shoulder, causing the room to quiet without any command. Park questioned Min-jae's persistence, acknowledging some decent calls during testing, but dismissing him as dead weight unworthy of a combat slot. Min-jae clarified that he was not asking for a combat position, but Park insisted that in the city, every slot eventually became combat, and people like Min-jae would be the first to die. Park then turned away to greet an S-rank Lancer amid scattered applause. Min-jae remained alone as rejection notices accumulated on his tablet, all marked declined. He exhaled once, and the noise of the hall faded. His eyes scanned the ceiling trusses, the vibrations in the polished floor, the stress around the east emergency shutters, and the faint mana instability in a relay conduit behind the recruitment displays. He recognized everything as part of a system. His gaze settled on a maintenance map near an evacuation route indicating that Sector C transit concourse was a temporary civilian overflow with incomplete reinforcement. The shame on Min-jae's face disappeared, replaced by calculation. Outside in Safe Zone A13, the civilian concourse C9 was darkened by rain. Vendors sheltered under emergency awnings while refugee families moved between ration stations. Above them, old rail supports and newer mana conduits formed an ugly patchwork. Min-jae walked quickly with his tablet open, comparing city schematics to the actual structure overhead. He stopped beneath a service arch, and a translucent overlay appeared before his eyes, activating structural analysis. Red fractures spread across a support collar hidden under fresh sealant, and a cheap retrofit relay flickered with unstable mana flow. Min-jae looked toward the sealed transit tunnel and heard a low, wet scraping behind steel before the alarm sounded. Red lights flooded the concourse as the public system announced a localized breach warning in Sector C9 transit access, with hunters en route and civilians instructed to proceed to marked shelters immediately. People froze briefly before panic erupted. The shutter at the tunnel mouth bulged inward twice, then a locking seam split on the third impact, leaking black fluid. Min-jae's interface flashed warnings of a minor breach, seal integrity at 23%, and a 61% probability of a support arch failure cascade. The threat was not only from monsters. If the shutter failed, the arch above would collapse into the evacuation corridor, turning it into a deadly crush point where hundreds could die before hunters arrived. A security officer raised his rifle with shaking hands, ordering people to move, causing the crowd to jam instantly. A person fell, and a cart overturned as the shutter screamed under a claw's punch. Min-jae shouted at the officer in the blue jacket to pull civilians left instead of straight back because the corridor narrowed in 20 meters. The officer hesitated but then followed Min-jae's command, shouting new directions. Min-jae sprinted to a maintenance panel, ripped it open, and examined cables, relays, and emergency couplers. Data flooded him: temperature, mana density, mechanical slack, and anchor fatigue. He slammed his palm against the panel, causing a luminous schematic to unfold over the shutter and archway, showing braces, angles, load arrows, and stress vectors. Min-jae called for metal, barricade rails, carts, sign frames, anything rigid to be brought to him. After a moment of hesitation, an old maintenance worker urged people to move, and they scrambled to gather materials. The shutter exploded inward as 3 hound-type dungeon creatures forced their heads through the gap, all black chitin and teeth. The security officer fired wildly. One beast shrieked but kept advancing. Min-jae ignored the monsters and focused on the arch. He jammed 2 steel crowd control rails beneath the cracked support collar at sharp angles and tore mana cable from the panel with his bare hands. The cheap steel glowed blue as impurities burned away in sparks, and the rails hardened under his grip. He bound the cables around the brace points exactly where the blueprint indicated. The first hound tore free and landed just as the floor beneath it dropped 6 centimeters. This was a stress release panel Min-jae had unlocked from the maintenance grid. The creature stumbled, and the officer finally landed a clean burst, blowing half its skull apart. The other 2 hounds pushed through together, peeling the shutter frame and causing the whole arch to groan. Min-jae shouted for everyone to get down and slammed both hands into the brace assembly. The blueprint expanded through concrete and steel as he initiated emergency reinforcement and manual load transfer override. Mana from the damaged conduit rerouted through his temporary frame, and for one impossible second, the collapsing arch hung on light. Then the load shifted, concrete dust burst into the air, and the overhead mass settled onto Min-jae's improvised reinforcement instead of the evacuation path. The corridor remained open. People ran through, including a mother dragging 2 children and an old man who should have died but stumbled past, staring at Min-jae in disbelief. The second hound lunged, but a blade of compressed air cut through its neck, and its corpse crashed across the wet floor. Seo Yuna landed between the civilians and the breach, her coat snapping behind her. 2 assault hunters and a shield bearer rushed in after her. Yuna took in the scene at a glance: the broken shutter, the redirected crowd, the glowing braces holding up half the concourse, and Min-jae kneeling in dust and sparks with both hands locked on the frame. Even she looked surprised and questioned if Min-jae had done this. The third hound leaped, but Yuna vanished and reappeared above it, bringing her blade down in a silver arc that split the monster apart before it hit the ground. Silence fell in jagged pieces, broken only by the alarms. Then Director Han Tae-sik stepped through the security cordon, umbrella lowered, his coat immaculate despite the rain. Emergency strobes washed the Sector C concourse in red. Broken rail carts lay scattered beneath the sagging arch. Dead hound-type monsters piled near the security tape where civilians still trembled. Kong Min-jae stood in dust and sweat, one hand resting on the crude reinforcement he had built from scrap steel and mana cable. A translucent system window hovered at the edge of his vision, indicating emergency field reinforcement complete. Structural stability increased from 71% to 89%, and class proficiency increased. Director Han studied the braced arch with hard, tired eyes. Professor Chai Mira scanned it while Seo Yuna leaned against a cracked pillar with folded arms. Park De-yoon stood farther back, visibly irritated that Min-jae had proven useful. Director Han asked if Min-jae had built a reinforcement in under 4 minutes. Min-jae confirmed it took 3 minutes and 42 seconds and explained that if the mana cable had snapped, the arch would have failed in less than a minute. Professor Chai agreed, bringing up a holographic stress map over the damaged concourse, noting that the load path had been realigned in a crude but efficient manner using 38% less material than standard emergency protocol. Park De-yoon dismissed it as a hallway patch job. Min-jae corrected him, insisting it was not a patch job but proof. He explained that the district wall had the same problem on a larger scale: layered repairs, mismatched reinforcement, and mana mesh conflicting with physical bracing. Continuing standard repairs only made the wall weaker and more expensive. Silence settled over the group. Director Han acknowledged that Min-jae was asking for authority. Min-jae requested a trial commission for one damaged section with limited scope and budget, promising that if he failed, they would lose a wall segment they already planned to rebuild, but if he succeeded, they would stop wasting resources on ineffective repairs. Seo Yuna narrowed her eyes, noting that Min-jae had already chosen the section. Min-jae named North 12, explaining that while everyone focused on the cracked outer face from the last pressure event, the real problem was the footing underneath, which had settled due to corrupted subsoil. Repairing only the surface would cause the shell to peel off with the next impact. Professor Chai looked up sharply, revealing that she had inspected North 12 that morning and that the report had not been released. Min-jae said he had seen the stress pattern from the tower approach. For the first time, Director Han's skepticism shifted into calculation as he asked how much. Min-jae proposed a repair plan that required only 40% of the standard budget, 3 days of work, and a small labor crew using reclaimed steel, low-grade mana cement, anchor rods, and cable stock. Duyun laughed at the suggestion, dismissing the budget as insufficient for anything serious. Min-jae responded calmly that the cost reflected the consequences of the combat-first budget, which favored superficial fixes over real repairs. Duyun stepped forward, but Yuna's subtle movement caused him to halt. Director Han made the final decision to grant Min-jae a trial limited to District Wall North 12, warning that any delay or compromise would result in shutting down the project. He added that if Min-jae's approach proved successful, they would scale it up. Min-jae acknowledged the terms with a nod. At dawn, District Wall North 12 stood over the service road like a wounded giant, its outer face blackened and cracked, with one side of the foundation dangerously sunk. Nearby, heavy construction drones waited idle, ready for the usual demolition and recast procedure. Min-jae gathered a small crew of 3 workers who had not been specially selected. Mr. Oh, a gray-haired former maintenance foreman, Jisoo, a young welder with a prosthetic arm, and Tae-ho, a quiet ex-logistics rigger. Mr. Oh recognized they were the crew assigned for the job, and Min-jae confirmed it was temporary. Jisoo smirked, noting the poor budget they had been given. Min-jae accepted the label, calling garbage a material resource. Min-jae explained the flaws of the standard repair method, which stripped the wall's face and poured a fresh shell that looked clean and tested well briefly, but ultimately failed as impact loads transferred into the old footing. Instead, Min-jae's plan was to make the wall honest rather than just prettier. He described an underslung support lattice, deep anchor redistribution, and a maniconductive shear web that would tie the damaged skin into a new internal skeleton, rerouting force into stable ground with less mass, better load transfer, and faster recovery after impact. Mr. Oh expressed surprise, saying this was not typical wall repair. Min-jae agreed, saying it was teaching the wall how to survive being hit. Tae-ho studied the blueprint and asked about the plan, which Min-jae outlined in detail. The next 3 days passed in a blur of sparks, dust, and calculations. Jisoo cut reclaimed beams while Min-jae marked exact lengths with glowing blueprint lines. Tae-ho lowered anchor rods into drilled shafts as structural values scrolled across Min-jae's vision. When Mr. Oh cursed at a pile of warped scrap, Min-jae touched it, causing a pale geometric pattern to spread through the metal, straightening bent pieces just enough to use and burning away impurities in blue dust. Professor Chai arrived with portable mana sensors and frowned at the lattice, criticizing the asymmetrical spacing. Min-jae explained it was intentional to break the predictable resonance caused by the Black Maw's rhythmic attacks. Chai stared for a moment before admitting that the logic made sense despite her initial reservations. One evening, Yuna appeared atop the scaffold, silently watching as the internal shear web was bolted into place. She observed that Min-jae built as if expecting the wall to be alive. Min-jae responded that anything under repeated attack eventually behaved that way. At the supply depot, a clerk refused to release higher-grade cable, citing lack of authorization. Min-jae presented revised calculations showing how 2 lower-grade spools and 6 relay clamps could be braided to achieve equivalent tensile capacity for less cost. The clerk hesitated, noting it was not standard, and Min-jae pointed out that was why the stockpile still existed. Duyun visited from a vehicle platform, unimpressed by the hand-built brace, predicting it would fail under 1 ogre ram. Min-jae ignored him and insisted on testing it with something stronger than Duyun's opinion. On the 3rd night, floodlights illuminated North 12. The repaired section no longer appeared smooth but deliberate, with recessed reinforcement channels, interlocked steel ribs, anchor housings, and mana lines buried beneath the surface rather than painted over. Director Han, Professor Chai, Yuna, Duyun, and a line of barrier officers stood behind the safety barrier. An industrial impact rig powered up, its siege ram humming. Han offered a final chance to call off the test. Min-jae wiped concrete dust from his jaw and ordered the standard test to run, then to increase the impact by 20%. Some officers murmured objections about exceeding validation limits, but Min-jae insisted, and Han nodded approval. The ram slammed forward. The first impact thundered through the wall, dust falling and warning lights lights flashing on monitors, but the repaired section held. Chai reported deflection with intolerance and better than expected. Han ordered another strike. The second impact hit harder. An unrepaired nearby section groaned, but Min-jae's segment absorbed the force and settled without cracking or mana instability. Duyun's expression changed, and he called for another strike. The third strike came at increased power, producing a brutal metallic boom that shattered the old wall beside the repair shed. Min-jae's section locked tighter. Blue lines ignited beneath the concrete skin as the internal mana web carried the force downward and outward into the redistributed anchors exactly as designed. Che's eyes widened, declaring the load transfer efficiency optimized and seemingly impossible. Yuna looked at Min-jae without mockery, acknowledging that he had made the impact make the wall stronger. Min-jae watched the readings stabilize and allowed himself a slow breath, reflecting that he had taught the wall where to suffer. The next morning, gray light spread over Safe Zone 13's northern expansion site, revealing broken asphalt, rebar stumps, excavator tracks, and survey flags trembling in the wind. There were no walls or towers yet, only an empty field beneath a tired sky, with the old barrier looming in the distance, patched one time too many. At the center stood Kong Min-jae in a hard hat, tablet in hand, blue blueprint projections layered over the earth showing concentric lines, trenches, buried channels, and chambers. To others, it looked absurd, but to Min-jae, it already looked like survival. His system vision painted the ground with stress maps, water tables, mana density gradients, and breach predictions for the coming Black Maw wave. Director Han Tae-sik stepped beside him, coat snapping in the wind, and questioned the starting point. Min-jae crouched and pressed his fingers into the dirt, causing a faint blue line to spread outward. He explained that this was not where he wanted to start, but where they had to, because building on the surface first would lead to death from below. Han watched the projection rotate. It was not a wall, but a layered organism sunk into the earth. When Han asked how long it would take, Min-jae answered that it would take longer than anyone wanted, but less time than rebuilding after a breach. Han exhaled slowly and granted the site, telling Min-jae to convince the rest. Minutes later, workers, logistics crews, support classes, and skeptical hunters gathered around a holographic terrain map. Professor Chai Mira stood near a portable mana analysis rig with arms folded. Co Yuna leaned against a crate of anchor rods, silent and watchful. Park Duyun stood with his assault team, unimpressed. Min-jae activated the projection, and the barren field bloomed into a fortress cross-section. A murmur ran through the crowd when they saw how much deeper it went than it rose. Min-jae explained that the fortress did not begin with walls but with ground control. He revealed the first layer, a broad excavation basin with sloped runoff channels. He explained that Black Maw creatures carried corrosive fluids, mana residue, and burrowing vectors, and that pooling blood, rainwater, and dungeon runoff at the base would kill the foundation before the first assault ended. The channels branched outward like arteries, with sediment traps, pressure gates, and purge pits. Che's eyes sharpened as she recognized that Min-jae was separating physical water flow from mana runoff. He confirmed that mixing the two caused unpredictable mana density spikes, leading to reinforcement misfires, conduit overloads, and free corrosion for the enemy. Her skepticism gave way to recognition. Min-jae raised the second layer beneath it, interlocked deep piles and a lattice foundation. He explained that this was a distributed load foundation, not a single slab or wall line, but a layered grid designed to survive even if 20% of the upper structure was destroyed. A worker asked if a thicker foundation would be faster. Min-jae glanced toward the old wall and explained that thicker was not smarter, because a single massive slab cracked and transmitted failure throughout. He wanted damage to stay local, stopping at each line and dying there. The workers murmured, and Duyun snorted, dismissing the plan as building a bunker for dirt and predicting the wave would arrive before damage localization mattered. Some of his hunters laughed, but Min-jae ignored them and expanded the blueprint again. The third layer of the fortress revealed narrow internal corridors between reinforced shells, with angled walls and offset lines designed for lethal efficiency. Min-jae described this as the kill corridors. The design eliminated any straight breach path, heroic charge lanes, or single gates where monsters could gain momentum. He pointed out overhead slots, side chambers, drop grates, and retractable barriers. Any intruder would lose speed, formation, and visibility inside. Large bodies would get wedged, fast ones redirected, and flying creatures forced downward by a mana shear mesh. Each meter inside would cost the enemy more than the last. Yuna recognized that even if the outer line broke, the inner defenses were deadlier than the front. Min-jae confirmed that hunters would fight where the structure aided them. Duyun remained skeptical, suggesting they could meet the enemy wave outside and kill it there. Min-jae countered by asking what would happen if Black Maw changed tactics again, sending burrowers beneath their feet, flyers overhead, and corrosives blinding rear support. He warned that winning a battle outside could still mean losing the city behind. Duyun said nothing but tightened his jaw. Min-jae then pointed to the deepest part of the projection, where glowing channels ran through the foundation like veins. He explained that the fourth layer consisted of mana conduits embedded within the foundation itself. Unlike the old barrier, which treated mana as an add-on system, this design integrated mana flow into the load paths. When impact or mana pressure hit, the forces would redistribute without isolated relay towers or exposed trunk lines vulnerable to severing. Chai called it a structural nervous system, and Min-jae called it a living one if they could finish it. After a brief silence, Director Han ordered the excavation to begin. Excavators tore trenches through asphalt and old utility lines while survey drones projected topography grids. Workers laid geotextile mesh and corrosion barriers into the earth. Chai calibrated mana probes as technicians drove crystal stakes into place. Drill rigs hammered deep piles into stable strata, and Min-jae's structural analysis highlighted weak pockets in red. Teams poured the first bedding layer for precision rather than strength. Steel cages descended into shafts, drain channels were lined and sloped, and dyed water tests confirmed proper flow into purge basins. At one point, Min-jae stopped a concrete pour halfway, stepped into the mud, and redrew an entire retaining angle after detecting groundwater pressure 7% above projection. The exhausted workers stared at him in confusion before following his revised plan. By afternoon, Do-yoon observed from a ridgeline as hundreds labored below. The fortress still looked like a muddy, expensive crater. His vice-captain expressed disbelief that Director Han had bet resources on such a slow and unimpressive start. Do-yoon focused on Min-jae, who directed conduit sleeves before any visible wall existed, and admitted it looked slow. Late in the day, an alarm sounded as the eastern trench wall trembled and partially collapsed. Mud and broken concrete slid into the pit, forcing workers to stumble back. Min-jae rushed to the scene. His system flooded with stress vectors, revealing the failure was not random. An old buried transit duct, crushed long ago, had left a hidden void filled with water. If the trench collapsed, the adjacent conduit bed and two pile lines would fail as well. He ordered all heavy equipment on the east side to stop immediately. He instructed Jisoo to activate vent pumps and told Foreman O to bring short triangular braces instead of long ones. Min-jae projected an emergency brace blueprint across the failing slope, directing supports to be driven at specific points to split the slide rather than fight it. His certainty moved the workers faster than panic. Yuna entered the pit amid dust and offered to cut the slope. Min-jae pointed to a bulging section of compacted soil and shattered concrete, warning that cutting deeper would rupture the water pocket. She nodded and sliced exactly where he indicated. The slope sheared as planned, splitting the failing mass into two smaller slides that crashed harmlessly onto the trench floor. Pumps roared to life, braces slammed into place, and muddy water was redirected into the channel instead of flooding the foundation bed. Everyone stared in silence for a long moment before the sight steadied. Min-jae stood in the mud, breathing hard, the blueprint light reflecting on his face. Around him, workers who had doubted him looked at the saved trench, intact pile lines, and rerouted water, finally understanding that he was not merely drawing impossible plans in the air. He could see the fortress before it existed and, more importantly, how it might fail and stop it. Even Do-yoon remained silent. Below, in the deepening pit, the first shape of the future took form. Floodlights burned against the night like artificial moons. 3 days earlier, Safe Zone A13 had been an empty expansion lot. Now steel ribs rose from the excavated ground, concrete bastions stood half-finished and raw, and cables ran overhead and underfoot in disciplined bundles. The site resembled not a wall but the skeleton of a machine. At the center of the construction site, Kang Min-jae stood over a projected blueprint hovering above a portable planning table. Blue lines layered with red hazard paths and yellow load arrows cast cold light across the faces around him. Professor Chai Mira, Co Yuna, Director Han Tae-sik, Foreman O, Jisoo, Taeho, Park Do-yoon, and a cluster of exhausted workers. Min-jae explained that the wall was only the face. If the enemy reached it intact, they had already wasted too much strength. He expanded the projection to reveal internal passages, narrow, angled, segmented. He emphasized that they would not let the enemy reach the wall intact. He tapped one corridor, causing metal shutters to materialize in sequence. These automated gates were not for keeping things out, but for deciding where the enemy would die. Chai identified the system as pressure segmentation. Min-jae revealed floor plates, hidden channels, counterweights, and mana relay nodes. He explained that Black Maw sent mass, not elegance. Hounds, burrowers, chargers rushing the widest path, following mana density, and attacking visible resistance. The fortress created false paths, narrowing throats, offset turns, and pressure-triggered closures to counter this. Do-yoon suggested simply stationing hunters in the corridors to kill the enemy there. Min-jae countered that when numbers grew from 10 to 50 to 200, hunters were not structure. They tired, hesitated, and died if forced to stand where a gate should have stood. Yuna recalled C9, the tunnel, the gantry, and how one wrong position had become a coffin. She asked Min-jae to show the sequence. Min-jae triggered a simulation. A red mass entered the first approach tunnel. Pressure markers flashed as a rear gate slammed shut behind the enemy group. Another gate opened halfway ahead, forcing compression. Side vents burst open, releasing sand, dust, and mana-disruptive particulate that blinded and destabilized monster senses. The floor tilted slightly, throwing the lead units off balance. A grating section collapsed beneath concentrated weight, dropping the front wave into a lower pit lined with steel stakes and conductive mesh. The rear gate sealed. Survivors trapped in the middle lane were hit by lateral bolt launchers hidden in armored recesses. The simulation ended. Director Han exhaled slowly and asked if they could build all of that before the wave arrived. Min-jae responded that not every variant could be completed, but identified 3 mandatory sectors: the primary north approach, the east breach fallback, and the internal emergency kill corridor behind Gate 2. If materials held, they would add crush chambers. Taeho asked about crush chambers. Min-jae explained they were counterweight sealing plates designed for short-drop impact against heavy-class organisms. Taeho swallowed nervously at Min-jae's casual tone. Min-jae warned that crush chambers only worked if the timing was exact. Casual use would get people killed. Later, in the fabrication bay, sparks showered like orange rain as workers assembled segmented gate frames thicker than vault doors. Mana channels glowed through engraved steel. Jisoo calibrated pressure plates with trembling but precise hands while Chai adjusted a relay prism. Min-jae explained that if the pressure system malfunctioned, it could close prematurely and trap their own people. He proposed a new relay logic pattern combining weight, vibration signature, mana density, and directional flow, so the gate would open only on confirmed outbound clearance and close on inbound anomalies. Professor Chai observed that Min-jae was designing a fortress that could think, but Min-jae corrected her, saying he was designing one that would not hesitate. Before dawn, the team isolated a controlled section of the unfinished fortress for testing. Reinforced barriers sealed the lane, rifle teams and observation crews lined the catwalks above, and searchlights cut through the drifting dust. A scout sprinted to the command platform, reporting contact at the excavation edge. A small pack of creatures heading straight for the mana conduits without any lure team. Dune reached for his weapon, ready to intercept, but Min-jae ordered no engagement. He activated his skill, initiating structural analysis of the half-finished lane, revealing gate weights, plate tolerances, trigger loads, conduit pressure, and every potential failure point. Beyond the floodlights, larger dungeon hounds appeared, broader and more menacing than previous scavengers, with black hides ridged with bone and pale vapor leaking from their jaws. 2 burrowers followed, low and plated, their claws sparking against concrete. Yuna warned that if the creatures broke the lane before the sequence, disaster would follow, but Min-jae assured her they would not. He commanded all stations to hold, forbidding melee engagement unless he called failure, and ordered gate crews to stand by for manual override only on his mark. The first hound crossed the painted threshold, triggering a pressure plate, but nothing happened. The pack accelerated, sensing open space ahead. Dune smirked, confident the trap was too slow, but a thunderous clang interrupted him as the rear gate dropped, shaking the lane and trapping the hounds inside. The forward shutter opened just enough to invite them in. The floor nozzles detonated, releasing compressed dust and manastatic grit that engulfed the pack. The lead hound slammed into the narrowed opening, jamming and blocking the rest. Min-jae gave the order, and a side wall split open as 3 piston bolt launchers fired in perfect sequence, steel bolts punching through blinded bodies and pinning 2 hounds to the gate frame. The burrowers reacted quickly, dropping low and clawing at the floor to tunnel under. Min-jae ordered an early trigger on plate 7. Jisoo activated the control rune, collapsing a rectangular floor section and causing both burrowers to vanish into a lower trench. Conductive mesh flared blue, forming a cage of crackling mana, and the smell of burnt flesh rose. 1 surviving hound leapt backward, hitting the sealed rear gate, then twisted and sprang for the wall. Yuna reached for her sword, but Min-jae commanded her to hold. The hound's paws struck a side panel, releasing a hidden latch above it. A counterweight slab dropped, crushing the creature and silencing the lane. Dust drifted through the floodlights as the only sound was the fading hum of the mana mesh below. No hunter had entered the lane, and no blade had swung. For a moment, no one moved, then the workers erupted in shouts, laughter, and disbelieving curses. Taeho repeatedly affirmed that the system had worked. Director Han gripped the rail, staring down at the mangled kill lane as if witnessing the future taking shape in concrete and steel. He then instructed Min-jae to build the system again, everywhere it mattered. Dune looked at the dead monsters with a tight jaw, showing no mockery for once, only calculation and something close to fear. Yuna stood beside Min-jae, acknowledging that he had been right. Min-jae remained unsmiling as workers descended to reset mechanisms, remove bodies, check bolt housings, and measure gate drop speed. The fortress was being born through repetition and proof rather than inspiration. Suddenly, the sirens changed from the local test tone to the real one, long, deep, and urgent. Every face turned toward the northern darkness beyond the unfinished walls. On the horizon, far past the floodlit excavations, the night itself seemed to move, forming a black line, then many, then too many. Professor Chai went pale as mana readings began to spike. Cold white floodlights still burned against the gray afternoon, cutting through dust from non-stop construction. Steel ribs rose from poured concrete, and mana conduits pulsed beneath translucent insulation like veins. Beyond the unfinished earthworks, the northern dead ground stretched toward the Black Maw boundary. A crowd gathered, consisting of workers, technicians, barrier officers, and hunters. At the center stood the newly completed fortress approach, a wide entry lane narrowing into 3 armored channels lined with recessed slits, segmented shutters, and overhead rails. It resembled less a wall and more a machine waiting to consume. On an elevated platform, Kong Min-jae studied a floating blueprint while Professor Chai monitored mana telemetry. Seo Yuna leaned against the railing, arms folded and eyes sharp. Below, Park De-yoon arrived with his strike team in polished armor, their Iron Fong insignia gleaming on their shoulders. He stopped before the central lane and smirked, mocking the fortress as a miracle wall and the engineer's answer to a dungeon wave. A few hunters snickered, commenting that it looked expensive and slow. De-yoon tapped a wall plate with his gauntlet, suggesting it was built by a man afraid to fight. Workers stiffened, Yuna's gaze hardened, but Min-jae did not look up. He told De-yoon to complain somewhere that did not obstruct the test lane. De-yoon laughed and stepped closer, claiming that people were beginning to believe the fortress mattered more than hunters, shifting morale and resources, and that Director Han was gambling the whole zone on concrete and trapdoors. Director Han stood nearby with security staff, remaining silent. De-yoon then loudly announced a proper live test. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Professor Chai warned that the section was calibrated for controlled enemy flow, not a live assault, but De-yoon interrupted, pointing toward the dead ground. He proposed drawing in a pack for his team to kill in the open, fast and clean, to prove the fortress unnecessary. Min-jae finally raised his eyes, flat and cold, accusing De-yoon of wanting to provoke a live approach outside the unfinished perimeter to make a point. Yuna asked what would happen if the point pulled more than a pack, and De-yoon replied that they would kill more than a pack. His team grinned. Min-jae turned to Director Han, insisting that if the live test proceeded, the gates would remain under his control. Han exhaled slowly, recognizing the political as well as tactical stakes, and approved the test with the condition that Engineer Kong would command the field if things went wrong. De-yoon smiled as if he had already won. Later, warning sirens pulsed twice. The fortress approach opened with a grinding metallic roar. De-yoon and Iron Fong advanced just beyond the fallback line, while Min-jae remained on the control platform, manipulating holographic seals. Structural analysis appeared before his eyes, threat path prediction ran, and the kill corridor array remained on standby. Professor Chai watched the readings tensely, noting a fast-spreading mana disturbance in the northwest quadrant, not confined to one cluster. De-yoon planted his mana-edged spear and released a flare of aura into the air as a taunt and challenge. The earth responded. Black shapes burst from the haze. Dungeon hounds came first, dozens of them, low and fast, followed by armored maulers. Then the ground erupted as burrowers punched upward in sprays of dirt and stone. The crowd gasped at the overwhelming number. Yuna muttered that De-yoon was an idiot. De-yoon's grin faltered, but he ordered his team into formation for a front intercept. Iron Fong surged forward in a practiced wedge, and for 10 glorious seconds they fought magnificently. Spear arcs severed hounds in half, a hammer user crushed skulls, and a caster scattered burning lances that pinned shrieking bodies to the dirt. Monsters fell, and hunters on the wall began to cheer. De-yoon glanced back toward the platform, smug once more. Then the second wave hit. The hounds ceased their direct charge and split wide to the left and right. Burrowers dove beneath Iron Fong's feet, disrupting their footing. 2 maulers crashed through the center, aiming not to kill but to break the formation. Min-jae's eyes sharpened as he recognized the adaptive pattern. The monsters were screening. Professor Che's telemetry flashed red, indicating more signatures behind the initial wave. The ground beyond rippled like boiling water as a third mass approached. De-yoon realized the threat a moment too late. A burrower erupted beneath him, hurling him through the air. A hound tore into the caster's leg. The hammer user turned to assist but took a mauler's shoulder charge full in the side. The wedge collapsed and the cheering died. De-yoon was slammed by a hound. He killed it mid-leap, but 3 more monsters were already on him. Above, Min-jae's hand hovered over the controls while Yuna watched him. Min-jae ordered to open channel 1, close the exterior side flares, and guide the monsters inward. De-yoon looked up in fury, warning against being boxed in, but Min-jae insisted that leaving the field open would mean death in under 40 seconds. He slammed his palm down, triggering a dramatic change. Massive side barricades burst from the ground, cutting off lateral escape routes. Warning lights shifted from white to crimson, directional sirens screamed, and dust canisters detonated along the flanks, creating opaque walls that blinded the monsters on the perimeter and left only one clear route straight into the fortress channel. The monsters took the channel immediately, followed by the trapped hunters. De-yoon shouted for everyone to move inside, feeling humiliation as he retreated exactly where Min-jae had designed. The first hounds surged into the narrowed lane. A shutter dropped behind them, and another slammed down on ahead, splitting the pack into segments. Recessed slits opened, firing piston bolts in synchronized bursts. Black blood sprayed across the concrete. A mauler triggered pressure plates beneath its own feet at the first gate. The floor tilted under its weight, and overhead impact hammers dropped with a deafening boom, crushing its spine into the channel floor. Duyun's team stumbled along the safe strip marked by thin blue lines. Min-jae's voice cut over the loudspeaker with razor precision, instructing them to stay on the blue lines, not to jump or touch the walls, and to move 5 meters ahead to the right side recess. The injured caster hesitated as a hound lunged from the dust. A side panel snapped open, and a retractable spear punched through the beast's throat just centimeters from her face. She froze in horror, then ran. More monsters flooded the corridor behind them as planned. Shutters isolated them in segments. Static grit sprayed into their eyes and mana organs. Bolt launchers tore apart the front ranks. Side lanes funneled stragglers into angled pits where electrified cable meshes flashed blue-white, turning shrieks into smoke. The fortress did not fight wildly. It processed the threat one chamber at a time, one mistake at a time, one body at a time. Workers stared in disbelief. A technician whispered that the fortress was hurting the monsters. Professor Chai corrected that it was deciding where the monsters were allowed to die. Duyun reached the inner barricade with 2 surviving teammates dragging the wounded behind them. He turned just in time to see the last burrower attempt to leap the safe strip. The wall opened, and a crossfire of bolts tore the creature apart midair. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of cooling mechanisms and the wet drip of black blood onto steel. Duyun stood breathing hard, his armor smeared, pride in ruins. He looked up at Min-jae on the platform. The hunters who had laughed before now said nothing. Min-jae met Duyun's stare without triumph, only cold certainty. The fortress had answered for him. Gray dawn spread over safe zone A13, turning concrete dust into battlefield smoke. Floodlights clicked off one by one as the sun climbed over the half-built northern fortress, a rising mass of steel, rebar, conduit, and layered walls. Workers stood on scaffolds. Hunters guarded the perimeter. Civilians crowded behind temporary barricades, staring not at a hero but at the structure itself. A giant holoscreen, rigged from old evacuation signage, replayed yesterday's combat test. Iron Fong driven back, Channel 1 sealed, monsters dying in sequence, trap lanes closing like the jaws of some machine god. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A woman identified the captain from Iron Fong. A man noted that the captain only survived because the gates opened for him. An elderly worker shook his head, insisting the captain survived because the gates closed on everything else. A person pressed both hands to the fence and asked nearby if that was their wall. She looked at the unfinished bulk of reinforced concrete and manolith support ribs and nodded without hesitation, acknowledging that it was. In the emergency budget chamber, Director Han Tae-sik stood at the center of a ring of screens and exhausted officials. Behind him, 2 casualty projections glowed on the wall, the old plan in red and Min-jae's fortress plan in blue. The difference was staggering. Councilwoman Lim adjusted her glasses and questioned the request for triple the materials allocation to an unlicensed independent engineer. Han did not blink and insisted he was asking for survival. Professor Chai Mira tapped the display, bringing up overlays of foundation lattice, kill corridor spread, and mana relay integration. She specified the need for a 218% increase in reinforced aggregate, priority access to dormant transit steel, 6 high-grade mana capacitors, and labor reassignment from non-critical civic projects. Official Kim questioned the request for 6 capacitors, noting they were strategic reserve assets. Han replied that this was a strategic extinction event. Another official noted that public pressure was changing, citing 43 formal petitions since sunrise. Messages flooded upward demanding the engineer be allowed to build, volunteer shifts be opened, the north be fortified first, and that if hunters could not hold, the wall must. The room already knew the answer. Councilwoman Lim exhaled and provisionally approved the request with daily oversight and full audit authority, warning that if it became a vanity project, there would be consequences. Han assured it would not. A stamp hit the table, and authorization flashed across the central display. Resource priority elevated. Fortress Project A13. The change at the construction yard was immediate. Trucks arrived one after another, carrying stripped subway beams, ceramic mana insulation panels from a shuttered reactor district, fastening nodes, sealant foam, vibration sensors, and military-grade anchor rods. Workers jumped down before ramps fully lowered. Volunteer crews arrived, along with demolition crews, retired builders, a former shipyard welder, utility workers, and an entire drainage team reassigned from Sector F. Min-jae stood in the center with a tablet in one hand and blueprint projections spinning around him in translucent blue layers. His class window flickered at the edge of his vision, showing engineering status, blueprint manifestation active, and a large-scale coordination bonus applied. He exhaled once, not in relief but in calculation. He instructed Mr. O to sort steel by load category rather than length, ordered Jisoo to pair every volunteer crew with an experienced lead, lead, forbade anyone from touching conduit sleeves without calibration tags, and told Taeho to scan transit beams for corrosion and mana burn before integration. People moved instantly, no longer questioning why. From an upper platform, Seo Yuna watched with her arms crossed. She noted that Min-jae now had a city listening. Min-jae admitted that was not always helpful. Yuna replied that it was better than being laughed at. He glanced toward the fence line, where the crowd had grown larger, including civilians, media drones, guild observers, political aides, and men in expensive coats pretending not to take notes. Yuna's smile held no humor as she said that meant Min-jae had become important. The city turned quickly. Volunteers poured aggregate under floodlights while people folded paper signs reading "Build It Higher." A local netcast host who had previously mocked Min-jae now narrated footage of Channel 1 with breathless admiration. A market district hung a banner offering free meals to Fortress crews after shifts. Lower-ranked hunters reported for support duty, embarrassed but present. A shrine table appeared near the north gate with incense, bottled water, and handwritten charms for the workers. Donations arrived as well, reclaimed copper coils, old armor plating, industrial batteries, and private reserve mana stones. Min-jae revised blueprints constantly, marking red lines over blue projections, adjusting wall thickness, conduit spacing, and fallback gate timing. Professor Chai smiled when a crate opened to reveal polished black crystal rods. She asked where Director Han had found resonance-stable core rods. Han entered the yard, followed by armed logistics officers escorting a sealed government container. He explained that the council had released the shipment after reviewing the previous day's footage multiple times. Min-jae narrowed his eyes. He noted that this would allow them to finish the load balancing grid. Professor Chai added that they could also complete the adaptive relay loop, ensuring the gate shutters would not desynchronize during mana surges. For a brief moment, Min-jae imagined a fortress capable of surviving Black Maw's learning. Then he noticed the wrong crate. The label, seal color, and weight distribution were all incorrect. His vision sharpened as he activated structural analysis, focusing not on the structure but the crate's contents. He detected a hollow beneath the insulation foam filled with mana-reactive powder. Min-jae ordered to stop the crate immediately. The yard froze as workers stumbled back. Yuna reacted first, leaping onto the truck bed and slicing the latch open. Inside, beneath legitimate ceramic paneling, compact mana destabilizer charges were concealed. Professor Chai turned pale, realizing the catastrophic potential if those charges had entered the conduit trench. Min-jae confirmed that such sabotage would have corrupted the entire relay spine. Han's expression hardened as he commanded the yard to be locked down with no one allowed to leave. Weapons were drawn, and panic rippled through the volunteers. Min-jae climbed onto the truck and knelt beside the sabotaged crate, carefully examining the packing angles, compression marks, foam cuts, and false panel placement. He concluded the sabotage was deliberate and professional. Yuna questioned whether it was guild sabotage, but Han identified it as political or commercial sabotage, or possibly both. Park De-yoon arrived with 2 Iron Fang members and stopped abruptly at the scene. He assessed the situation and declared that the attackers were trying to kill the build. Min-jae corrected him, stating that the goal was to make the fortress fail in a way that would appear to be his mistake. This realization struck harder than the explosives themselves. If the engineer failed, the city would revert to relying on swords and speeches, and millions would die. Han ordered a full chain audit on every shipment, demanding verification at the gate, yard, and installation points without exceptions. Yuna committed to assigning hunters to escort materials. De-yoon hesitated before stepping forward to take responsibility for the night perimeter. He warned that anyone wanting to destroy the walls would have to get through Iron Fang first. Yuna acknowledged his resolve, and Min-jae nodded in recognition, not friendship but acceptance of usefulness. By sunset, the fortress had risen higher against the hazy skyline, becoming too large to ignore. Crowds gathered every evening on the hill above the site, bringing food, blankets, prayers, fear, and hope, all focused on the unfinished wall. Min-jae stood atop a partially completed bastion spine, observing drills, welding sparks, and conduits pulsing faintly as black crystal rods slid into place. The fortress was beginning to appear alive. Professor Chai joined him with a slate, reporting that with the new materials and labor, they could regain nearly 2 days in construction time. Min-jae cautioned that this was only if sabotage did not cause further delays. He had expected resistance from Black Maw. He looked toward the dead northern ground and then back at the city, aware of the watchers, officials, drones overhead, and the weight of their attention. The monsters were coming, but now the city was watching too. Floodlights illuminated the northern fortress construction zone, cutting through drifting dust. Steel ribs, half-finished walls, mana conduits, and scaffold towers rose like the skeleton of a machine-built beast. Workers moved in disciplined lines while hunter patrols swept the perimeter. Warning sirens pulsed low, signaling readiness rather than alarm. A translucent blueprint overlaid the unfinished fortress in front of Min-jae's eyes, displaying load paths, heat signatures, mana pressure maps, and every moving part of the project. Everything appeared on schedule, yet Min-jae sensed something was wrong. He stopped walking and stared toward the outer approach lanes. Professor Chai asked what was wrong. Min-jae knelt beside a conduit access seam and pressed his hand to the concrete, activating his skill. Blue light rippled through the wall and into the ground. His expression hardened immediately as he announced that the relay bed had been touched. Chai expressed disbelief, noting that nothing had breached the perimeter the previous night. Min-jae clarified that the intrusion was not past the perimeter but beneath it. He instructed Chai to call Yuna and wake Director Han for a full subgrade scan of the east and north sectors. Chai complied without argument. Minutes later, Min-jae, Chai, Yuna, and a support squad moved through a raw concrete tunnel beneath the outer wall. Emergency strips cast red light along the passage. Cables ran overhead, and mana pulsed through embedded channels like blue veins under stone. At junction E4, Min-jae stopped and pointed to a hairline crack in the wall. Yuna folded her arms, questioning if that crack had shut down the entire site. Min-jae traced the crack to a conduit anchor and observed a tiny mound of powder beneath it. He noted the absence of pressure bloom or impact marks, concluding the damage was not forced from outside. Che's eyes widened as she realized it was a probe unit. Min-jae agreed, explaining it was something small, not attempting to breach but testing stiffness, mana density, and anchor spacing. Yuna's expression darkened as she understood that the dungeon had sent scouts to measure the wall. Min-jae stated that the dungeon had stopped attacking like an animal. Silence fell briefly before a hollow impact echoed from deeper in the tunnel. Thunk. Then again, the passage vibrated around them. Chai checked her tablet and turned pale, reporting mana fluctuations across multiple lines. The strikes targeted relay nodes rather than gate fronts. Min-jae concluded that the dungeon was mapping the network. He ordered Yuna to take surface teams to the north brace line, instructing no hero charges and to kill any small attackers first. He directed Chai to isolate conduit sections B through F with hard disconnects every 40 meters to prevent a single corrupted line from compromising the entire grid. Yuna hesitated, asking if this was the main attack. Min-jae replied that it was reconnaissance with teeth. By dawn, the Black Maw's new strategy became undeniable. Instead of sending a horde, specialized waves attacked the fortress in precise, unsettling ways. Spider-like creatures with bone drills targeted retaining walls instead of gates. Flat, ill-bodied monsters wriggled through drainage channels, biting through insulation sleeves. Lean hounds ignored exposed workers and repeatedly attacked identical points along unfinished seam locks. From a scaffold platform, Min-jae watched through a magnified hollow feed, his expression furious rather than surprised. He identified the targets as construction joints, utility entries, and conduit choke nodes. Director Han arrived beside him, coat snapping in the wind, and demanded a report. Min-jae pointed out the different attackers' roles: drill types testing wall-based depth, eels attacking mana insulation, and hounds repeatedly impacting unfinished seam locks. Han questioned whether the monsters could know all that. Min-jae explained that the Black Maw had learned from every successful defense, gathering data on hardened areas, force redirection, and which lanes killed fastest. The monsters were not just adapting to hunters, they were studying his design. A heavy boom interrupted them as the western relay tower flickered and a section of embedded conduit shifted from blue to violent purple. Che's voice came over comms, reporting mana contamination in line C2 caused by a rupture in the lower sleeve, injecting unstable flow. Min-jae moved quickly to the relay chamber, which hummed like a wounded engine. Blue-white arcs snapped between housings, and embedded crystals pulsed irregularly. One wall bulged inward where something had struck from beneath and retreated. On the floor lay the corpse of a new Black Maw unit, a pale segmented creature with a needle skull and crystalline jaw. Chai crouched beside the corpse, noting that it had pierced the conduit casing but died from overload. Min-jae studied the fracture pattern, casing, and internal flow, then narrowed his pupils. He declared that the creature had succeeded. It had not only broken the casing but altered the resonance. If this occurred after full activation, the surge would jump 3 link towers. Chai looked up slowly, realizing the potential for chain failure exactly where their redundancy was weakest. Yuna entered the command area with her sword stained by black blood. She reported that the outer north sector was clear for the moment but warned of an increasing number of unusual enemy units, burrowers and cable chewers, that rarely fought unless cornered. Kong Min-jae stood up, his face briefly showing strain, not from fear but from a sense of violation. The fortress had always represented certainty to him: inputs, outputs, tolerances. Now the enemy was deciphering those equations. He explained that the dungeon was evolving specialized units not just for killing but for breaching, corrupting, and undermining the fortress's systems. Essentially, it was building its own engineers. Later, on the central command platform, alarms flared across the tactical display. Red markers spread beneath the fortress footprint like a spreading disease. Min-jae stood before a projected cross-section of the entire defense complex while workers, officers, Professor Chai Mira, Kara, director Han Tae-sik, Yuna, and Park Do-yoon gathered around. Do-yoon scowled and insisted that the solution was simply to kill whatever approached the walls. As always, Min-jae countered that chasing surface contacts would lead to defeat. He expanded the projection to reveal faint lines beneath the outer wall, mana conduits, drainage channels, and load transfer webs. Red vectors stabbed toward these systems from below and at odd angles. Min-jae explained that the Black Maw had realized the fortress was not defined by its walls but by its systems. If these lines failed, the outer structure would be reduced to ordinary concrete and steel. Han's expression grew grim as he asked how long it would take the enemy to make a real breach. Min-jae silently ran calculations on mana attenuation and failure cascade probabilities before confirming that the enemy already understood enough. Murmurs spread across the platform. Do-yoon slammed his fist on the rail, demanding a plan to strike back. Min-jae turned calmly and declared that they must redesign the fortress immediately. Professor Chai blinked in surprise at the idea of redesigning mid-construction, but Min-jae began issuing precise orders. He instructed abandoning single-path relay logic in favor of splitting every major line into braided tri-channel bundles with sacrificial breakers between nodes. Drainage would be rerouted away from conduit beds even at the cost of transit access. False utility routes would be doubled to mislead the enemy. He pointed to the underground map and ordered the installation of hollow decoy conduits equipped with volatile backflow traps designed to destroy enemy units and collapse tunnels if triggered. The workers stared in disbelief, and Chai expressed awe at the ruthless complexity of the plan. Min-jae overlaid a new blueprint atop the old one, revealing a more layered, deceptive, and ruthless design featuring false arteries, burn channels, and internal amputation points. He explained that if the dungeon was studying him, he would give it the wrong lesson. Yuna's grin flashed fiercely, embracing the challenge. Floodlights cut through dust, steam, and freezing mist over the half-finished northern fortress. Black steel ribs jutted from the ground, trenches lay open, cranes hovered over reinforcement pits, and workers moved in sharp bursts beneath emergency sirens. A deep, unnatural thud rolled through the earth, followed by another. Ground monitors flashed red. On the command platform, a holographic blueprint hovered above a steel table, its lines pulsing like veins. Too many routes glowed red. Min-jae stood over it with bloodshot eyes and rolled up sleeves, his engineering interface layering stress vectors, mana flow, drainage pressure, and breach probabilities across the design. The fortress no longer looked like a fortress but a battlefield. Min-jae rejected patching the damage, explaining that doing so would teach the enemy the correct solution. Professor Chai asked what he proposed instead. Min-jae dragged a glowing line through the blueprint, splitting the main relay spine into multiple branches, some ending in dead ends, others looping backward or feeding empty chambers. He declared that they must stop defending the design they wanted and build the design the enemy deserved. Director Han demanded a concise explanation. Min-jae stated that from that point on, every system the enemy read must be a lie, every layer broken must be expendable, and every path opened must lead to a location already chosen by the defenders. After a brief silence, Han approved the plan. Minutes later, the construction zone descended into controlled chaos. Workers tore out fresh conduit sleeves before the concrete had cured. Orders streamed from tablets to headsets to crane operators. Min-jae entered the east subgrade trench, boots splashing through slurry and mana runoff, and pressed his palm to a relay bed. A translucent wireframe bloomed as his structural analysis skill highlighted hairline instabilities in orange. He marked 3 points and instructed Foreman O to leave one channel visible and reinforce it just enough to survive the first impact. O hesitated, noting that this was the channel the enemy had targeted, but Min-jae insisted it must look important. He pointed to a deeper line and ordered real load transfers to be placed 2 meters lower and offset 17 degrees, shielded with non-uniform stone fill and broken scrap density rather than clean aggregate. Jisoo reviewed the schematic and frowned, warning that this would make the scan profile ugly. Min-jae met her eyes and said that was the intention. A tired grin broke through her exhaustion as she acknowledged that ugly designs save lives. The redesign spread in real time. Min-jae redrew corridors directly onto steel panels while drones projected updated geometry. Outer utility channels were widened and made obvious, glowing with bright mana signatures. Beneath them, narrower armored routes were hidden in crushed basalt, irregular mesh, and offset shock pockets. Sacrificial breaker nodes were bolted into relay intersections. Drainage culverts zigzagged toward false sump basins filled with corrosive mana-neutral gel. Empty chambers were constructed behind wall thicknesses shaped exactly like control rooms. Kill corridors gained split gates to redirect different enemy types toward different deaths. Professor Chai rewrote sensor logic so the fortress would report confidence in systems that were actually decoys. By dawn, a new schematic rotated above the fabrication tent, showing concentric defense bands, a red outer skin, an amber middle spine, and a green core. Min-jae explained that Layer 1 was no longer a wall but bait. Park Do-yoon folded his arms and accused the plan of sounding like surrender disguised as math. Min-jae clarified that the first line existed to be broken. Ji-yoon's jaw tightened, but before Min-jae could respond, Yoona stepped forward and described the strategy as trading dirt for time. Min-jae nodded and tapped the outer shell, explaining that Layer 1 gave the enemy what they expected: visible relays, obvious support channels, and standard pressure paths. The enemy would penetrate, celebrate, and commit mass forces. He tapped the next ring and said that Layer 2 would close behind them, cut retreat, drain momentum, and force heavier units onto bearing plates calibrated to fail in sequence. Chai recognized these as progressive collapse zones. Min-jae corrected that they were controlled collapse zones, designed to break enemy formations and bury their rear lines. Ji-yoon studied the model, his skepticism fading into concentration. He asked what would happen if the enemy adapted again. Min-jae rotated the inner network on the blueprint, showing mechanical segments shifting. He declared that the fortress would change faster than the enemy could learn it. Chai stepped closer and whispered about adaptive routing. Min-jae explained that while full adaptation was impossible due to time constraints, the fortress would have enough gates, split nodes, and local control to deny compromised routes and open new ones. He emphasized that hunters would not defend fixed corridors. Instead, the corridors would defend the hunters. Even Ji-yoon had no response to that. The first probe wave struck before the redesign was complete. Burrow spikes erupted from the mud. 3 bone drill spiders charged the east retaining face while eel-like mana leeches writhed toward the lower drainage lip. Sirens wailed. Yoona reported contact at the east and lower drain. Hunters moved to engage, but Min-jae remained focused on the monitors. One screen showed the obvious conduit lane, bright, vulnerable, and irresistible. The spiders veered toward it exactly as planned. Min-jae ordered live fire on the lead unit but instructed to hold until it committed. Ji-yoon challenged him, fearing the relay might crack, but Min-jae assured him it would not. The lead spider drilled through the exposed casing, releasing blue mana sparks. For a tense moment, everyone believed the line was real. Then the breaker node detonated. A contained implosion folded inward, collapsing a pocket around the lead spider and the 2 behind it. The trench wall slumped downward into a pre-cut void rather than outward. The monsters vanished beneath steel mesh and slurry. A delayed pulse traveled down the false conduit into a sealed chamber 50 meters away. Pressure bolts fired in sequence, causing the chamber to detonate. On the monitors, nearby enemy signatures shifted toward the blast, following the wrong target. Chai Mira exhaled in disbelief, noting that the explosion had redirected the creature's aggression. Min-jae explained that the enemies now believed they had found the fortress's heart and immediately moved to respond. At the lower drainage channel, the mana leeches poured into a culvert that accepted them too easily. Oh shouted from the catwalk that the creatures were inside. Min-jae grabbed the manual wheel and spun it forcefully. 3 gates slammed shut in a staggered sequence, shifting water pressure. The culvert divided, flushing half the creatures into a gel sump that turned them white and brittle. The rest spilled into a maintenance crawl where hidden electrodes ignited in a blinding lattice. The channel flashed like lightning trapped in a pipe. Yoona landed beside Min-jae, her blade wet with black fluid. She observed the dead channel and then the fortress, which continued to change line by line under attack. Yoona remarked that they were no longer just building. The fortress had become a battlefield. Min-jae locked the wheel in place and looked toward the command platform, where the holographic plan kept shifting with every new contact report. He acknowledged that he was now commanding terrain made of concrete. Another impact boomed from the north. The central map bloomed with fresh enemy vectors as the creatures tested, searched, and learned. Min-jae climbed back to the platform and slammed both hands onto the console. The blueprint expanded, revealing buried lanes, decoy hearts, sacrificial routes, and the protected inner core. He described the fortress as not static but a layered argument against invasion. Min-jae ordered all teams to update their doctrine. No one was to die holding Layer 1. If it began to fail, they were to fall back by design. If a route opened unexpectedly, they were to assume it was either opened by him or was a trap earned by the enemy. He emphasized defending function, not symbols. Before dawn, floodlights burned through dust and freezing mist over the northern fortress site. What had once been an excavation pit now resembled a battlefield of machines. Half-risen walls of black transit steel, exposed conduit ribs, cranes swinging overhead, and workers moving like ghosts beneath alarms that never fully stopped. On a suspended platform above the central trench, Kong Min-jae studied a hovering blueprint stained with red warnings indicating material stock was 31% below projection. Mana capacitor allocation was delayed, and worker fatigue was critical in 4 sectors. Professor Chai Mira climbed up beside him, tablet in hand, with dark circles under her eyes. She reported that the reserve steel from Sector 9 had never arrived. Min-jae asked if it was held up. Chai explained it had been reclassified for priority redistribution because 3 council districts had filed emergency requisitions after last night's breach reports, pulling stock for their own barricades. Below them, welders sparked in a line until one spark stopped as a worker dropped to one knee, breathing hard. yard. Min Jae's jaw tightened as he asked how many shifts the workers had run. Chai answered that it was too many. By morning, the command container was full of tension. A digital map of Safe Zone A13 rotated above the central table while Director Han Tae-sik faced 3 city oversight officials in spotless coats, their polished badges contrasting with the grime outside. One official insisted the council was not sabotaging the project but balancing survival priorities. Han responded that this was done by stripping steel from the only structure designed to survive the wave. Another official countered that the council was ensuring outer districts were not politically abandoned. Min Jae entered, his boots whitened with concrete dust. Seo Yuna followed with her arms crossed, already prepared for confrontation. One official addressed Min Jae, asking why his latest revision increased material consumption by 18%. Min Jae tapped the map, causing hidden relay paths and false ones to light up. He explained that the dungeon had learned their first logic and deception cost material. The official replied that everything cost material and recommended simplification. A revised plan appeared on the screen, showing cleaner wall lines, reduced depth, and fewer internal gates, cheaper overall. Min Jae noted that the revision removed the secondary shear webs. An official called them redundant. Min Jae countered that they stopped progressive collapse. Another official argued that if the outer shell held, progressive collapse would not matter. Min Jae stared at him and said that such thinking was why people died in failing buildings. Silence followed. Yuna smirked without humor and warned that Min Jae was being polite. Han folded his hands behind his back and asked the officials to state their recommendation clearly. The third official stated that they had to finish a defensible fortress by the deadline using reduced standards or miss the deadline chasing perfection. Those were the realities. Min Jae said nothing but tightened his hand at his side. Later, in the fabrication yard, metal beams slammed into place and mana torches hissed blue-white over cut steel. Workers moved slower now. A foreman wiped sweat from trembling hands. He reported shortages of anchor bolts, lattice plates, and sleep. 2 people had passed out in the west trench, and 1 welder had fused a bracket off angle due to exhaustion. Min Jae knelt beside a brace assembly, checking dimensions by touch and skill overlay. Green guidelines flickered over the steel, then one turned orange, indicating tolerance drift. He moved to the next assembly, which also showed drift, and then another. The design was not failing. The people building it were. A crash rang out nearby as a stack of cut plates toppled, barely missing a teenage volunteer. Yuna caught the kid by the collar and yanked him back. She warned him to keep his eyes open unless he wanted the fortress to bury him before the monsters did. The volunteer nodded shakily. Min Jae rose and looked across the yard. Everywhere he turned, he saw not collapse but the approach to collapse. The stage before accidents became statistics. He ordered to stop line 3. The foreman blinked in surprise, noting that stopping would lose 6 hours. Min Jae insisted that if they did not stop, they would lose people. He raised his voice, mandating rotation with 20-minute rests every 2 hours, no solo welding, and no heavy lift crews under 4 members. Groans rose immediately. A supervisor said they would not finish. Min Jae looked toward the unfinished inner bastion, all steel skeleton and exposed nerve. He already knew. That night, rain tapped against the roof of the command container. The blueprint hung in the dark like a ghost city. Min Jae stood alone before it, sleeves rolled, fingertips black with graphite and grease. He dragged sections apart, cut layers, rerouted loads, and deleted assemblies he had spent days refining. Every removal felt like tearing out part of himself. The side door opened quietly, and Do-yoon stepped in. Do-yoon mentioned that Director Han had said Min Jae was still there. Min Jae explained that he was cutting down the design to what they could afford to finish. Do-yoon studied the changing design, noting fewer redundancies, fewer elegant flow optimizers, shorter maintenance loops, and simplified trap resets. The design remained dangerous and intelligent but harsher. Do-yoon recalled that Min Jae had once preferred death over compromising a design. Min Jae laughed tiredly and without humor, saying that was something people said before they were responsible for everyone inside it. He zoomed in on the inner wall cross-section, showing the better version with cleaner load transfer, easier long-term repair, and more graceful failure behavior. His finger slid and whole sections vanished. He said this was the version they could finish before the wave. Do-yoon asked if it was weaker. Min Jae confirmed it was weaker. The blunt honesty hung between them. Min Jae added that incomplete perfection was just another ruin. Do-yoon was silent for a moment, then nodded and asked where he needed bodies. Min Jae looked up, noting no mockery or challenge in Do-yoon's acceptance, only grim resolve. Min Jae assigned Do-yoon's team to manual gate crews, replacing 2 auto-hammer lanes with hunter-operated kill chambers. When Do-yoon asked if this was because of the steel shortage, Min Jae confirmed it was due to pistons needing alloy they no longer had. Do-yoon nodded once and said they would be the alloy. After Do-yoon left, Min Jae stared after him, then turned back to the blueprint. He deleted the final elegant curve from the bastion throat and replaced it with a blunt angular choke. The new design was less less efficient, faster, easier to fabricate, and much harder to love. At dawn, sirens groaned low over the site as section chiefs, hunters, and crew leaders gathered on the central platform. Min-jae projected the revised fortress model into the gray morning air. Murmurs spread immediately. The new version was visibly rougher, more brutal, and stripped of grace. Min-jae declared that they were no longer building the best fortress he knew how to build. The murmurs died. Min-jae emphasized that they were building the strongest fortress possible within the time constraints. He outlined the modifications. The outer lure routes, decoy utility lines, and inner relay core remained intact, but secondary shear webs were reduced, non-critical maintenance arteries were cut, 2 automated kill corridors were converted into manual defense sectors, and aesthetic shell plating along with symbolic architecture and ceremonial gates were cancelled. There would be no excess. A civilian coordinator hesitated, expressing concern that the fortress would look unfinished. Min-jae responded by gesturing toward the workers with bandaged hands and hollow eyes behind him, and the half-built fortress looming like a wounded beast refusing to yield. He insisted that if the fortress held, it would be finished. Professor Chai observed Min-jae, understanding the true cost better than anyone else. This was not about pride but identity. Engineers usually dreamed of elegant, inevitable solutions, but this fortress no longer felt inevitable. It felt desperate, necessary, and alive. Yuna stepped forward first, signaling that they must build what could survive. She drove her blade point first into the muddy platform beside Min-jae like planting a flag. Jiyun followed, signaling the Iron Fang squad, then the foreman, and finally the workers. One by one, helmets lifted, tools were raised, and exhausted shoulders straightened. Director Han said nothing, but his expression hardened into something resembling faith. Min-jae looked up at the jagged blueprint hanging over them all, marked by ugly angles and missing comforts. It was enough. Outside the northern fortress, floodlights carved white lanes through dust and rising concrete. The site no longer felt like a construction zone. It felt alive, strained, overworked, and one failure away from collapse. Alarm runes flashed along the parapets in red and amber, accompanied by a low siren trembling through every corridor. On the command platform, hollow blueprints spun above the central table, sectors glowing in layered colors indicating bait routes, sealed corridors, active conduits, and manual defense chambers. Kong Min-jae stood over them with bloodshot eyes and a clenched jaw. Professor Chai monitored spiraling manaflow graphs. Seo Yuna waited at the platform edge in full armor, one hand resting on her blade. Park Diyun stared at a blinking section deep inside the fortress, not the outer wall but inside. Professor Chai reported that Sector Inner 3 had just lost relay coherence. Diyun expressed disbelief, noting that nothing had breached the north channels. Min-jae confirmed that nothing had come from outside. He zoomed the blueprint inward and saw a maintenance artery beneath the inner transit corridor flash black, then crimson. That line had been sealed after the redesign. Che's expression darkened as she explained that this was not a monster breach pattern. The shutdown sequence had been authorized. Silence fell over the room. Yuna realized the breach was from inside. Then the platform shuddered under a violent boom, and alerts exploded across the holomap. Inner gate C7 had been forced open, and a manual override accepted. Jiyun demanded to know who had inner override clearance. Director Han replied that only command staff, engineering leads, and the logistics chief had such clearance. Min-jae immediately ordered a pull of every name with corridor-level authorization, locked command access, and decreed that no one could leave the platform without Yuna's approval. Another explosion thundered below. The lights flickered, then emergency strips ignited, bathing the room in blood red. Professor Chai warned of a mage pressure spike in the civilian transfer artery. Min-jae's expression changed instantly. That artery led toward the shelter elevators. He concluded that the attackers were not trying to destroy the fortress but were opening a guide lane. He traced the map and saw a hidden route through maintenance sectors, relay cavities, and unfinished service passages leading straight toward the population core. Diyun asked what the attackers intended. A chorus of screeches rose from inside the fortress itself. Everyone froze. The threat was not beyond the wall but within it. When Min-jae, Yuna, and Diyun reached inner transit corridor C7, smoke poured from a split maintenance hatch. Twisted steel peeled outward like torn skin. The corridor was only half finished, with exposed concrete ribs, hanging cable bundles, and emergency shutters not fully installed. Through the breach came the monsters. Dungeon hounds first, followed by pale crawler things with segmented jaws and glowing underbellies, tunnel feeders built for narrow spaces. Behind them forced a massive armored mauler dragging shattered conduit across the floor. Hunters fired from improvised barricades, while workers in stained uniforms fled deeper inside under escort. A hunter captain shouted orders to fall back to Junction 12. An emergency gate tried to descend but stopped halfway, sparks spitting from a severed control box. Someone had cut the line. Min-jae ran through the service spine with a tablet in one hand and a fold-out blueprint light in the other. Yuna and Diyun kept pace beside him. Min-jae explained that Inner 3 was never meant to hold a direct push. It was a utility backbone, not a battlefield. Yoon asked why it had killed doors, and Min-jae replied that he had planned for accidents, not betrayal. They rounded a corner and found the body of logistics chief Kim Song-ho beside an open panel, his throat torn open and access tag missing. Che's voice crackled over comms, reporting that the override had used Kim's credentials after death and that local relay lag suggested a cloned mana signature. Min-jae concluded that this was not just a traitor but that the Black Maw had learned their systems. Yuna's voice turned colder as she acknowledged that the Black Maw could fake identity. Min-jae explained that it did not need perfect imitation, only enough chaos to open one wrong door. He illuminated hidden conduits behind a maintenance wall and found an unfinished compression channel. If he opened it, he could turn the artery into a kill funnel. Yoon asked about civilians still inside. Min-jae hesitated only briefly before ordering Yuna to clear the shelter lane manually and Yoon to hold Junction 12 for 90 seconds without heroics, buying time rather than seeking glory. Yoon grinned despite the danger, acknowledging Min-jae's grim pragmatism. Yuna vanished in a burst of speed, and Yoon charged ahead with his squad. Min-jae dropped to one knee and began ripping safety locks from the panel with ruthless precision. At Junction 12, the defense line was already buckling. A mauler smashed into portable plating, sending hunters sprawling. Behind them lay the shelter descent shafts. Yoon ordered Iron Fong to half-step back and narrow the front. They tightened formation, forcing the monsters into a smaller approach. A hound leaped. Yoon split it from jaw to spine. Another slipped low and tore into a support hunter before Yuna dropped from an overhead beam like a falling blade, cutting two crawler things apart with one stroke. Yuna reported that the civilian lane was clear for 2 sectors and called to Min-jae. In the service spine, Min-jae drove a reroute spike into the exposed conduit. His engineering skill flared, turning the unfinished wall transparent in his vision, revealing stress lines, pressure points, and hidden seams. Then he saw a missing brace, deliberately removed not by monsters but by human hands days earlier. He murmured that there really had been a saboteur. Min-jae rerouted around the sabotage, slammed a manual capacitor into place, and twisted both locks. Deep in the fortress, colossal metal impacts rang out in sequence. At C7, ceiling shutters crashed down behind the invading monsters. Floor seemed split and side walls unfolded into angled steel baffles, turning the broad corridor into a narrowing wedge. Professor Chai announced that the compression channel was active. Min-jae ordered all units to fall back to blue markers, warning that anything left forward of Gate 12 would die with the corridor. Yoon grabbed an injured hunter and hurled him backward as the wedge tightened. The mauler lunged, and the floor beneath it dropped into an unfinished trench packed with exposed rebar and live conduit. White-blue arcs exploded upward. Crawler things convulsed and burst. Hounds slammed into each other in the narrowing lane. Yuna dashed across the collapsing edge and dragged the last support hunter clear. Yoon shouted that there was still movement behind the first wave. Min-jae acknowledged this. Then a different sound emerged from the smoke beyond the breach. Not claws, but heavy, measured footsteps. A humanoid figure appeared, plated in black bone and raw muscle, its elongated skull tilted with eerie awareness. Broken comm devices and stolen access tags hung across its chest like trophies. Its eyes burned with cold violet intelligence. Professor Chai identified it as the Adaptive Command Unit, explaining that it used recovered human materials as signal anchors. Yuna raised her blade, recognizing it as the traitor's partner. The creature raised one clawed arm, causing the half-destroyed emergency gate behind it to twitch as if trying to rise again. Min-jae ordered everyone not to let the creature touch any control surface. The creature moved with unexpected speed for its size. Yoon confronted it directly, and their impact sent dust flying from the walls. Yoon skidded backward, his boots carving grooves into the concrete. Yoon remarked on the creature's surprising strength. Yuna appeared from the side, her blade sparking as it struck the creature's ribs. The command unit twisted, anticipating and countering her attack. The creature had learned from hunters as well. Back in the service spine, Min-jae studied the blueprint. The corridor was barely holding. The inner wall nearest Junction 12 was overloaded. Emergency compression systems were not designed for prolonged combat. Cracks spread through the support structure like veins. Min-jae realized that if the wall failed, the containment line would collapse directly into the shelter approach. Director Han's strained voice came over the comms, asking Min-jae if the fortress could hold. Min-jae looked at the multiplying red fractures in the inner sectors and affirmed that the fortress could hold. He grabbed another relay key and ran toward the next node, adding that the fortress would hold only if the people inside did not fail first. At Junction 12, Yuna and Yoon stood side by side before the groaning inner wall. The command unit ahead of them displayed a mocking semblance of a human smile. Suddenly, another crack split through the structure. Floodlights cut through dust and steam in the fortress courtyard before dawn. The unfinished stronghold groaned under strain. Emergency shutters hung half-lowered. Weld sparks rained from catwalks. Medics moved among the wounded, and hunters in cracked armor rested against concrete barriers, catching their breath. At the center, a section of the inner wall had been torn open like a scar. Kong Min-jae stood on a temporary steel platform above the crowd, his face pale with exhaustion, his gloves blackened with carbon, dust, and blood. Below him, workers, civilians, reserve hunters, and administrators gathered in tense silence. Above them, a giant hollow blueprint flickered, showing whole sections of the fortress glowing red with damage and failure. Director Han stood beside Min-jae, his jaw tight. Min-jae observed the broken wall and stated that the crowd was waiting not for his call, but to hear whether everything had been a lie. Below, Seo Yuna wiped monster blood from her blade and looked up. Park Do-yoon stood nearby with one arm in a sling, his armor fractured and his face darkened with ash. Professor Chai Mira clutched a tablet overflowing with cascading system errors. People around them avoided Min-jae's eyes. A mother held a person close. A welder stared at his trembling hands. Somewhere in the crowd, a low-ranked hunter muttered that the creature had gotten inside. A worker responded bitterly that walls were just slower coffins. These words spread like poison. Min-jae heard them and looked down at the fractured concrete and the red warning lights reflected in coolant puddles. Memories flashed through him. People laughing when he first revealed his engineering class, calling it non-combat and dead weight. Empty lots becoming foundations. Blueprints becoming towers. Hunters surviving because corridors bent as he had designed. Then Min-jae stepped to the edge of the platform, the wind catching his torn coat. He acknowledged that the crowd was right. The creature had gotten inside. He pointed at the rupture in the wall and explained that the enemy had learned their doors, signatures, and systems, wearing them like stolen skin. If anyone thought the fortress meant a perfect wall, that idea had failed tonight. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Director Han started forward, but Yuna stopped him with one arm. She recognized that Min-jae was not breaking. He was recalculating. Min-jae instructed everyone to listen carefully. The hollow blueprint shifted. Red failure zones narrowed as new white lines spread across the damage. Min-jae explained that a fortress was not concrete, steel, his design, Professor Che's equations, or Director Han's budget approvals. He pointed at the workers, saying the fortress was not built because one engineer had a good idea. He pointed at the hunters, saying it did not hold because strong people swung weapons in front of it. Then he pointed beyond the wall, toward the shelters and the city behind them. He declared that a fortress was a promise. The silence deepened. Min-jae described the promise as one that if people slept behind these walls, somebody would check every bolt. If hunters bled in a corridor, somebody would make that corridor worth bleeding in. If workers poured concrete until their hands split open, that concrete would buy tomorrow. Faces in the crowd lifted. Min-jae admitted that if this had only been his project, it would already be dead. But it was not. His voice rose as he recounted how Iron Fong had held Junction 12 long enough for the compression seals to arm. Relay crews had isolated corrupted channels before the breach could jump sectors. Medics had kept wounded hunters alive in powerless corridors. Civilians had carried sand, coolant, rebar, ammunition, and stretchers under alarm conditions. Professor Chai had kept the system map ahead of the enemies. Yuna looked away, grim and embarrassed. Min-jae emphasized that every person there had already put a hand on the fortress and told them to stop calling it his alone. The statement landed hard. A worker in a yellow helmet straightened. Another tightened his grip on a tool belt. Min-jae gestured, and the blueprint changed again. Damage overlays became assignments, routes, and reinforcement zones. He explained that the Black Maw had adapted because it thought the fortress was a machine with one mind, a design it could study, a system it could corrupt. But they were going to teach it the truth. He pointed to the outer layer and ordered workers to perform the final armor pour on the bay corridors, making them loud, obvious, and irresistible. Another layer flashed. He assigned reserve hunters and trap crews to replace failed automatics with manual kill sectors. If the dungeon wanted human error, they would give it human judgment instead. Inner sectors lit up. Support brigades were tasked with water, sealant, cable feed, patch foam, medical supply, and debris running. No one was to enter combat lanes. Everyone was to keep the lanes alive. Professor Che's eyes sharpened as she began sending data packets. He instructed relay teams to cut every signature the enemy had learned, implement new handshakes every 4 hours, and require physical confirmation on all command routes. No credential was to travel alone. Do-yoon stepped forward and asked about the breach lanes. Min-jae told him to hold the manual sectors. Do-yoon hesitated, questioning if Min-jae trusted him with that. Min-jae answered that he did not trust Do-yoon personally, but he trusted what Do-yoon had seen. The crowd tensed. Do-yoon stared for a moment, then barked a rough laugh and accepted the responsibility. He turned to his battered team and ordered Iron Fong to stop guarding walls and start guarding function. His hunters snapped into motion and the movement spread. Yuna vaulted onto the lower rail and called all assault-capable hunters to follow her. She instructed them to clear lanes for workers and escort civilian convoys without ego, freelancing, or hero charges. She declared that the fortress stood because everyone did their job. The hunters responded with a roar. Professor Chai lifted her tablet and ordered technical mechanical crews to the relay spine stations to rekey the entire inner network. She congratulated anyone still able to read after 30 hours awake with a promotion. Nervous laughter broke through the fear. Director Han stepped forward, his voice carrying like a command order. He issued Safe Zone A-13 emergency directives. All non-critical district labor was reassigned to the Northern Fortress. Food, medical, and transit priorities were now fortress-linked. He declared that this was no longer a construction site but the survival line of the city. He slammed his fist against the rail. The courtyard erupted, not in panic but in motion. Under the floodlights, civilians formed bucket lines for quickset sealant. Welders sealed cracked hatches. Hunters hauled steel beams instead of posing for cameras. People in the shelter folded identification bands for logistics runners. Professor Chai rewrote relay codes while assistants swapped burned crystal nodes. Duyun's team painted sector marks by hand. Yuna directed traffic from atop a loader. Min-jae knelt in the dust, drawing a new stress route in chalk directly onto concrete. Workers saw the line, understood it, and built from it immediately. By morning, chaos had become rhythm. The rebuilt defenses were uglier than Min-jae's original vision. Manual braces, exposed reinforcement cages, emergency weld seams, hand-operated shutters, but they were real and they were finishing. At a safety barrier, a person from the shelter zone held up a strip of yellow fabric and tied it to the railing to mark the area as theirs. Min-jae stopped to watch her. Around the barrier, workers began tying gloves to rails. Hunters marked sectors with unit cloth, and civilians painted names on supply carts. These actions were not about ownership but about commitment. For the first time in hours, Min-jae felt his shoulders ease. Suddenly, the ground trembled. Floodlights flickered despite the daylight. On the far horizon beyond the dead ground, the earth bulged as black mana lightning crawled across the sky like cracking glass. Professor Chai Myra's voice exploded over the comms, announcing a mass emergence spike with multiple signatures, confirming it was not a probe this time. Sirens began to howl. Min-jae lifted his head and saw thousands moving into their chosen positions, not because he ordered them, but because they believed. He turned toward the wall and quietly accepted the coming attack. The northern fortress cut across the dead plain like a second horizon, composed of steel, concrete, mana glass, and floodlights. It was not elegant or beautiful, but it was finished. Arc lamps burned over layered battlements, crane booms stood frozen like exhausted giants, and fresh welds seemed still glowed in places. Beyond the outer kill fields, darkness seemed to breathe. Crimson warnings pulsed on every monitor tower, indicating rising dungeon pressure and an estimated full wave contact time. Wind dragged dust over trenches and mana stakes as the whole structure hummed like something holding itself together by sheer will. Inside the command platform, holographic blueprints spun above the central table, dense with rerouted conduits, fallback gates, trap sectors, and handwritten corrections. Kong Min-jae stood over them, his eyes red from sleeplessness. His engineering interface flickered beside the fortress schematic, showing stability at 82%, deception layers active, inner relay core responsive, and a high unknown adaptive threat index. Professor Chai Mira adjusted the projection with tired hands and reported that the outer relay loops were holding. Sector 9's replacement braces had survived calibration, and inner vent pressure was stable. Min-jae asked about the false signatures, and Chai confirmed they were broadcasting exactly as planned. If Black Maw was monitoring, it still saw 3 fake hearts and 1 vulnerable central spine. Min-jae nodded but did not relax. Seo Yuna leaned against the table, her armor half-buckled and sword at her side, watching Min-jae more than the map. She pointed out that he had checked the same load path 6 times, and Min-jae corrected her to 7. He added that if it failed the 7th time, it would probably fail the 8th as well. Even Chai almost smiled at that. Director Han Tae-sik entered carrying printed orders instead of tablets, emphasizing their authenticity. He announced that the final civilian transfer was complete, Shelter Core A was sealed, overflow had moved to the south transit vaults, and medical triage was staged under Inner Ring 2. He explained that if they lost the outer city, they would still preserve maximum civilian density. No one voiced the grim truth that if the fortress fell, millions would die. Min-jae inquired about manual sectors, and Han reported they were 87% crewed, though some volunteers had lied about their experience. Yuna shrugged, saying that everyone learned fast before the end. Park Duyun entered next, his coat torn and gauntlets locked on. He reported that Iron Fong was in position and that the West Kill Chamber crews wanted to know if the rotating shutters were supposed to sound like dying animals. Min-jae confirmed they were, and Duyun said the crews hated it, meaning they would remember not to stand under them. Duyun remarked that Min-jae had built a fortress that insulted people into surviving, to which Min-jae replied that he used whatever worked. Overhead, alarm tones pulsed softly, steady, patient, and waiting. In the inner courtyard under floodlights, workers performed final inspections. Hands checked bolts, mana seals flashed under handheld readers, and hunter squads walked retreat routes one last time. Painted arrows glowed across the ground in coded lines. Fall back, hold, seal, bait. Behind the inner barriers, civilians watched in silence. silence. A person broke from the line before a guardian could stop them and called out to Min-jae, holding up a charm made from bent insulation wire and strips of colored tape. Min-jae stopped and took the clumsy, person-made charm carefully, as if it were heavy. He clipped it to his chest rig, explaining that it was not for the wall but for him. The person beamed, and a guardian bowed repeatedly, embarrassed and grateful. As they walked on, Professor Chai glanced at the charm and remarked that it might be the first undocumented reinforcement in Fortress history. Min-jae said that if they lived, they would put it in the report. On the rampart walk, Seo Yuna stood staring into the distant dark beyond the kill zone, which was too quiet. Min-jae joined her, and for a while, neither spoke. Yuna admitted that when she first saw Min-jae's class, she thought it was a joke. She clarified that she had thought Min-jae was someone who survived by hiding behind useful people, but now realized she was wrong. Min-jae acknowledged that she had said worse things before. He looked out over the fortress and admitted that he did hide behind useful people: workers, researchers, logistics teams, hunters who held long enough for repairs, administrators who signed impossible requisitions, and civilians who kept showing up with food, prayers, and scrapwire charms. He sighed, saying that engineering only worked because other people trusted the thing he built enough to stand inside it. Yuna studied him and placed a gloved hand on the parapet. She promised that tomorrow she would not let anything reach him. Min-jae cautioned her not to make promises she could not measure. She faced the darkness again and said that her failure probability was low in his language. For the first time all night, Min-jae laughed quietly and briefly. Later, a heavy blast door opened with 3 physical keys, a mana signature, and a rotating mechanical wheel. Han Tae-sik, Seo Yuna, Park De-yoon, Professor Chai Mira, and Min-jae stepped inside. The chamber beyond lay deep beneath the inner fortress. No decoration, no wasted space, only brutal engineering. A vertical shaft dropped into darkness, ringed by black crystal rods, pressure pistons, anchor rails, and concentric mana channels carved into reinforced concrete. Thick cables vanished into the bedrock like roots. De-yoon stared and asked what it was. Min-jae stepped to the railing and activated his interface. He revealed that this was the part he never put on the official plans. Han turned slowly, surprised that Min-jae had built an unreported system under a city defense project. Min-jae corrected him, calling it a contingency under the project. Professor Chai looked down the shaft, realization dawning that this was not just a reactor shaft. Min-jae confirmed it was not. He touched the rail, and holographic rings flared to life down the cylinder, unfolding hidden geometry beneath the fortress foundation. Min-jae explained that if Black Maw broke through all 3 defense layers, if the inner core was compromised, if evacuation routes were gone, and the shelter line was about to be overrun, he could trigger Foundation Protocol. Last tide. He met each of their eyes as he said this. Silence followed. The hologram expanded, revealing the northern plain beneath the fortress grid. Buried channels, sealed reservoirs, collapsible geostructures, pressure locks tied to wall anchors, and trench networks. Yuna's eyes widened as Min-jae explained that they had buried everything excavated. Runoff lines, emergency cisterns, unused transit culverts, pressure chambers, everything hidden without changing the visible design. De-yoon's jaw tightened as he asked Min-jae to say it clearly. Min-jae stated that if they lost, he would break the ground. The model ruptured, showing retaining gates collapsing, buried mana-heated reservoirs flashing to steam, slurry channels erupting through pre-cut fault lines. The northern approach became a sinking torrent of boiling mud, steel shards, concrete teeth, electrified water, and collapsing strata, a man-made cataclysm. Professor Chai noted that this would liquefy the siege field. Han's voice hardened as he pointed out that it would destroy the outer fortress base and any defenders still outside. Min-jae confirmed both. De-yoon stared into the shaft and said this was not a defense system. Min-jae called it a denial system. Yuna added that it was a last resort. Min-jae emphasized that it was a real one. The chamber felt colder. Han asked why Min-jae revealed it now. Min-jae answered that if he died tomorrow, someone had to know when to use it. The hidden machinery hummed in the silence. Finally, Professor Chai asked if it could kill the core. Min-jae said no, but it could erase everything the wave needed to stand on: momentum, formation, tunnel mouths, support mass, turning a siege into chaos. Yuna asked what would happen if they triggered it too early. Han Tae-sik warned that crippling their own defense would only hand the survivors a ruin. He questioned whether it would be too late, and Park De-yoon responded that if it were too late, there would be no one left to save. After a long pause, Han decided that they would not use the self-destruct unless the fortress was already lost. De-yoon, Chai Mira, and Seo Yuna all agreed with this decision. Kong Min-jae touched the person's bent wire charm on his rig and closed his hand around it briefly, signaling his approval. Sirens shattered the pre-dawn darkness over the northern fortress. Beyond the dead industrial plain, a low red glow pulsed through the mist like a buried heart. Wind swept dust across concrete barricades, steel stakes, mine pylons, and half-buried sensor towers as every floodlight on the outer wall ignited simultaneously. Inside the command platform, holographic panels appeared above reinforced consoles. Threat icons multiplied rapidly until they overlapped. The system voice announced calmly that outer contact would occur in 90 seconds and that the wave density exceeded projections, reclassifying the event as a catastrophic assault. Professor Chai Mira worked the relay board with frantic precision, reporting that signal noise was spiking across all false heart channels and that the enemy was testing every broadcast simultaneously. Director Han Tae-sik studied the tactical display and noted that the approaching force resembled a continent in motion rather than a vanguard. Kong Min-jae examined the pressure map silently, observing the blue defense lines and the thickening red enemy mass. He concluded that the enemy intended to win on the first impact. Min-jae opened fortress-wide communications and ordered all sectors that Outer Layer 1 would absorb the first contact. He instructed that no one was to die defending base positions, that automated batteries would fire only on his mark, and that manual sectors must maintain discipline. He told them to trust the retreat map if their route turned red. Responses came immediately. Seo Yuna confirmed that the West assault teams were in position. Park Do-yoon rested his spear across one shoulder in the gate chamber below, with his squad ready to defend the junction. Workers sealed blast shutters, medics prepared stretchers, and volunteer crews loaded mana cartridges into emergency turrets with trembling hands. When the countdown reached 0, the earth shuddered. The monster wave appeared not as a line but as a flood. Bone-plated beasts crashed over the ridge first, low and six-legged with backs layered like shields. Behind them came hound packs, spine tower brutes, leaping crawler masses, and segmented tunneling creatures moving beneath the soil like plows through water. Farther back, towering silhouettes emerged through the red mist. The entire plain seemed to scream. Chai reported that surface wave density was 163% above the worst-case estimate. Han did not look away from the screen and asked how many monsters there were. Chai replied that there were enough. Min-jae checked load, range, thermal buildup, and approach vectors before raising his hand and ordering fire. The fortress came alive. Hidden panels opened along the glacis as automated cannon turrets rose on hydraulic arms and unleashed synchronized bursts of blue-white mana shells. The first ranks of monsters exploded. Buried mine grids detonated in staggered chains, forcing the wave to bunch where Min-jae wanted it. Steel cable launchers snapped from the flanks, tangling heavy brutes long enough for overhead rail lances to pierce skull and spine. Rotating boltcasters on the walls fired tungsten flechettes into the crawling masses. The plain became an engineered slaughter zone, yet the wave kept coming. On the west rampart, Seo Yuna leapt from the parapet. Her blade flashed silver as she decapitated 3 leaping hounds before landing on a barricade spine, marked with a warning to fall back if the line cracked. She smirked despite the chaos, noting the irony of writing on the battlefield. A bone-plated climber lunged at her, but she drove her sword through it and kicked it into a trench just as hidden electrodes discharged, sending a blue current that charred everything inside. At the south kill lane, Park Do-yoon's squad crouched behind retractable cover as a spine tower brute barreled through smoke. Do-yoon ordered them to hold and let the brute commit. The monster slammed into a weak support seam, which dropped away, plunging the brute chest-deep into a concealed compression pit as side walls slammed inward with piston force. Bone cracked like timber. Do-yoon thrust his spear through the brute's exposed eye cluster and commanded his hunters to clear the lane. His squad moved with brutal efficiency while overhead autoguns suppressed the next ranks. For the first time since meeting Min-jae, Do-yoon grinned like a man fighting inside a weapon larger than himself. Back on the command platform, numbers cascaded downward. Outer battery ammunition depleted, thermal strain increased, and sensor towers failed one by one under impact and corrosive spit. Chai reported sharp subsurface movement with multiple signatures under sectors 3 through 7. When Han asked about the pattern, Chai froze before stating that the movement was not random. The enemy was avoiding reinforced footings. Min-jae's eyes hardened as he realized they had learned the anchor map. Min-jae ordered all outer culvert gates to execute floodwash, trench teams to seal masks, and ground grid delta to pulse immediately. Drainage channels burst open as black water mixed with conductive slurry roared through the trenches just as tunneling monsters bulged the earth. Buried relay rods discharged, sending lightning across the wet channels in branching sheets. The ground flashed white as burrowers erupted half-cooked from the mud, twitching and smoking, only to be shredded by secondary gunfire. Han noted that Min-jae had electrified the runoff, and Min-jae confirmed that he had electrified where the enemy would choose to stand. The platform trembled under a heavier impact. The main screen zoomed out to reveal 3 colossal monsters advancing through the wreckage of the first ranks. A walking ram of basalt and bone, a hooked-limbed beast tearing apart mine pylons, and a creature carrying a swollen sack beneath translucent armor, pulsing with unstable mana. Chai went pale, stating that these monsters had not existed in prior waves. Min-jae confirmed their presence. Min-jae opened all channels and announced that siege-class monsters were approaching central sectors. He declared that Outer Layer 1 had passed its proof and ordered the beginning of planned degradation. He commanded the forces to fall back by route markers breakers, leaving the bright conduits and decoy emplacements to let the enemy believe they were winning. For a dangerous moment, crews hesitated, but training took over. Hunters disengaged, workers hit release switches, and teams retreated in disciplined bursts. The outer defense line appeared to buckle. The monsters surged forward. The basalt ram smashed through a glittering mana conduit mounted in plain sight, causing it to explode in a shower of blue fire, too bright and theatrical, painting the path ahead as if the fortress heart had been exposed. The wave howled and charged into the opening. Min-jae watched thousands pour exactly where he wanted them and ordered them deeper. The hooked siege beast tore open a gate shell and forced itself through. Pressure sensors flashed green, indicating the commitment threshold had been reached. Min-jae lowered his hand and welcomed Layer 2. The captured approach collapsed as whole sections of ground dropped into geometric pits. Side barricades rotated inward, turning retreat lanes into killing funnels. Hidden turrets rose from armored housings and fired upward into packed monster bodies at point-blank range. Overhead cable nets released and whipped across the breach zone, slicing lighter creatures apart. Even wall segments moved, interlocking on concealed tracks to narrow the enemy advance into 3 engineered throats. Seo Yuna landed in one lane, backlit by muzzle flashes. Park Du-yoon entered another with his squad. Sword arcs, spear thrusts, turret recoil, sparks, blood, dust, and shattered concrete merged hunters and fortress into one machine. The catastrophic red on the tactical display finally slowed. Layer 1 stability had fallen to 41%, but Layer 2 kill efficiency was rising rapidly. Han stared at the screen, almost breathless, acknowledging that the defense was holding. Min-jae did not smile. At the far edge of the enemy mass, the red mist still parted as more shapes emerged, larger and smarter. In the center of that moving darkness, one signal pulsed steadily, measured and observing. The Black Maw had watched the first layer die and learned from it. Min-jae gripped the console until his knuckles whitened and acknowledged that the first layer had proved itself. He lifted his eyes to the next incoming wave and declared that the real siege was beginning. Floodlights strobed through the smoke over Layer 2, transforming the battlefield into a scene resembling a machine consuming an army. Blue mana fire burned in collapsed culverts while cable nets twitched over pits filled with shattered bone. False conduits pulsed like exposed arteries, drawing monsters into lanes that ended in steel jaws, falling slabs, and electrified trenches. Despite these defenses, the monsters kept coming. Inside the command core, red warning panes stacked across the central display. Chimera reported a pressure spike on all 3 decoy hearts and noted that burrower losses were high, though rear formations were reorganizing. A new threat model appeared in white lines. Behind the first siege-class monsters, 4 larger signatures emerged. Min-jae zoomed in and clarified that these were not rear support units. One of the new threats was broad and low, armored in shifting black plates. Another towered on hooked limbs beneath a crown of rotating crystal spars. The third was lean and long-limbed, wrapped in glowing membrane sacs swollen with mana pressure. The fourth threat caused the room to fall silent. It was humanoid in shape, tall and armored in fused dungeon chitin and scavenged fortress steel, with broken gate hinges mounted on its shoulders like trophies. Its forearms ended in layered impact mauls. Chimera updated the classification, identifying it as a specialized siege package that had built a counterteam. Han Tae-sik asked for clarification, and Min-jae explained that the first breaker targeted walls, the Manasak creature targeted circuits, the ram targeted gate shock, and these 4 were designed for the core. A sudden impact shook the fortress, dislodging dust from the ceiling. Min-jae ordered all sectors to signal that the core defense contingency was starting immediately. Across the inner approaches, sirens shifted from a broad wail signaling wave contact to a sharp mechanical pulse. Shutters dropped over side passages, and yellow floor strips ignited to redirect traffic. Thick black letters painted on the concrete instructed, "Do not defend the line. Defend the function." Seo Yuna landed atop a broken parapet, her blade crackling as she observed the new monsters advancing through the wreckage of their fallen comrades. The plated beast rolled over collapsing ground without sinking, its shell flexing to redistribute weight. The crystal carrier drove hooked limbs into rubble and climbed through debris. The Manasak creature pulsed once, causing every dead false conduit ahead to detonate in sympathetic overload, destroying 3 defensive turrets. Yuna informed Min-jae over comms that the siege elites were rewriting the battlefield. Min-jae acknowledged and advised against engaging the plated beast head-on, as it was reading load transfer, recommending attacks on articulation gaps only. He added that the crystal carrier targeted structural rhythm and instructed to break its timing. After a pause, Min-jae warned Yuna not to duel the humanoid breaker in open ground. Yuna responded with a smirk, implying she did not enjoy fair fights. Meanwhile, Park Du-yoon and Iron Fong braced behind a reinforced cross-junction in the sublevel transfer corridor. New steel partitions had unfolded from the walls, narrowing the passage, and barricades locked into place. Overhead rails hummed with stored charge. Du-yoon noticed fresh weld lines lines in the floor and remarked that these had not been there an hour ago. A worker crew lead attributed the changes to Chief Kang's midnight revision. Duyun laughed softly, acknowledging the timing. A tremor ran through the corridor, followed by another. The wall display flashed a warning. Inner spine approach compromised. Controlled access routine armed. Duyun murmured that Chief Kang had anticipated this. At the central breach lane, the humanoid command breaker entered the trap district but did not charge. It stopped and looked around with almost human calculation as false retreat signals blinked from 3 corridors. Then it raised one maul and pointed. The plated beast veered left, the crystal carrier went right, and the Manasak creature hung back. They split perfectly. Chimera went pale in the command core, noting that the breaker had identified the bait pattern in 6 seconds. Han Tae-sik questioned if it was capable of that, and Min-jae confirmed it had already done so. Min-jae's fingers flew over a buried control panel, revealing a second map beneath the first that showed compressed chambers, pivot walls, ballast reservoirs, and deadweight shafts, systems hidden below Layer 2. Han Tae-sik asked if this was another layer, but Min-jae corrected him, explaining it was a breaker trap. Deep under the fortress, huge locks disengaged. The inner approach causeway groaned as cracks spread across the concrete in straight, engineered lines. Whole slabs rotated downward. The plated beast reacted instantly, shifting its weight to leap and landing on a narrow support rib. Then the rib dropped as well. Below was not a pit but a slope chamber lined with polished armor plate, conductive mesh, and angled impact fins. The monster slid helplessly downward as ballast gates dumped black slurry over its shell. A moment later, a white column of lightning struck. Current raced through the slurry and every overlapping plate in the plated beast's body, convulsed, its shell locking in an adaptive posture. Then a suspended concrete hammer slammed down 3 times. The breaker was broken. Cheers rose prematurely from the fortress walls. The crystal carrier had already adapted. It drove its hooked limbs into the side walls and struck in measured intervals, not random blows. Each impact landed as the chamber reset, causing hairline fractures to spread across the support housings. Chimera shouted that the crystal carrier was exciting the reload cycle and using the fortress's own timing against them. Min-jae's eyes narrowed as he decided to change the timing. Deep in the machinery void, flywheels disengaged and counterweights dropped. One side of the corridor network sank by centimeters while another rose, too little for people to notice but enough to disrupt rhythm. The crystal carrier struck again but missed the reset window. Its own force rebounded through an unsynchronized frame, shattering one hooked limb. Then an overhead maintenance beam, deliberately undercut hours earlier, sheared loose and pierced its crystal crown. Blue shards exploded through the air. At the eastern relay gallery, the Manasak creature stabbed tendrils into a false conduit trunk and began draining and overcharging it, searching for the real relay path. His body glowed brighter and brighter. Chimera saw the route on her panel and realized the line was fake and connected to a pressure sink. Min-jae completed the thought, identifying it as pressure sink 7. Outside, the conduit blossomed open like a flower. The creature was not feeding but being filled. Every unstable surge from damaged sectors and every redirected capacitor dump flooded into its absorption organs. For one impossible second, the Manasak creature hung there, luminous as a star. Then it burst. Molten mana tissue rained over the breach lane, and the blast erased 2 monster columns behind it. The fortress had turned the attacker into artillery. Only the humanoid command breaker remained. It walked through smoke and burning blue rain toward the inner core gate. Seo Yuna landed before it. Behind her, the sealed gate stood wrapped in fresh braces and emergency buttresses that Min-jae had ordered after midnight. The breaker studied her, then the gate, then the braces. It immediately understood the weak point. It lunged. Yuna intercepted, her blade screaming across its maw. The shockwave blasted dust from the walls. She gave ground exactly 3 steps, guiding the breaker into a soot-hidden square marked on the floor. Her comm clicked, and Min-jae ordered the trap activation. Yuna vaulted back as the breaker smashed both mauls down into a section of floor designed to collapse. Unlike the others, the breaker caught the edge with one arm embedded in the wall. It began hauling itself up with monstrous strength. Park Duyun shouted that they should not fight its strength. From the side corridor, he and Iron Fang triggered the new overhead rails. Magnetic harpoons fired point-blank into the mauls, the hinges, and the scavenged steel on the breaker's chest, not to pierce but to anchor. The rails reversed polarity. The trap chamber became an industrial winch, dragging the elite sideways as it clung to the wall, and the floor beneath it unfolded into grinding interlocked plates. Min-jae's voice came over comms, cold and final, stating that the breaker had been built to break gates. Red emergency lights strobed through concrete dust as a low mechanical groan rolled through the fortress like a wounded beast. On a wall monitor, the remains of the humanoid command breaker were still being crushed between segmented steel plates. Then every display flickered. The system voice issued a warning about relay desynchronization, core conduit pressure exceeding safe thresholds, and rising breach cascade probability. Min-jae froze for for half a second, not from fear but in calculation. Beyond the dead enemy on the monitor, the real disaster unfolded across the schematic. Power loops flared in impossible patterns, inner seals opened and closed out of sequence, and bulkheads read both locked and failed. Min-jae explained that the intrusion had rewritten itself into the relay logic. Professor Chai Myra's face paled as she rapidly manipulated a portable console, revealing that the entity had piggybacked on the clone signatures, causing every emergency correction to feed false confirmations back into the core. Han Tae-sik frowned and demanded clarification, prompting Min-jae to explain that the fortress was misidentifying damaged parts as healthy and healthy parts as expendable. Another impact shook the structure from below, and the schematic lines turned black. Chai reported that the sublevel coolant circulation had dropped to 42%. Min-jae corrected her, stating that it was not coolant but mana bleed suppression, warning that if it failed, the core chamber would arc itself apart. He turned sharply and ordered Yuna to accompany him, instructed Diyun to lock every path behind them to prevent anyone from following without his permission, and directed Director Han to move command to a secondary relay and keep civilians under shelter seal regardless of what they heard. When Han asked about the consequences if the chamber failed, Min-jae looked at the fortress map's pulsing heart and said that the entire structure would begin dying from the inside. The maintenance lift screamed downward through a cylindrical shaft lined with cables and mana conduits, sparks flying from ruptured panels as Min-jae, Yuna, and Chai descended. Yuna steadied herself against the cage wall, sword angled downward, and asked what she was protecting. Min-jae explained that the central load control chamber routed power, pressure, seal authority, and conduit priority to every critical system. He added that if it failed, everything would stop agreeing on what constituted a wall. The lift jerked and the lights went out briefly before dim blue auxiliary lights flickered on. Below, the shaft opened into an industrial cathedral. The core chamber was immense, a spherical reactor of steel ribs and mana glass suspended in a cage of trusses, with thick conduits radiating outward like arteries and catwalks crossing bottomless service voids. Steam, blue vapor, and dust swirled beneath rotating warning beacons. The entire chamber was unstable. One conduit bulged with white heat, another spat purple arcs, two lower seal gates ground uselessly against warp tracks, and a jagged breach split the concrete on the far wall, with black dungeon biomass creeping through it like roots. Chai whispered that the situation was worse than the readings indicated. Min-jae agreed. Min-jae jumped from the lift before it settled and activated a transparent display from his gauntlet, overlaying stress vectors on the chamber. He noted Conduit 6 was overpressured. The west seal servo had failed. The primary balancing ring was desynchronized, 3 anchor points were compromised, and only manual reroute was possible. He exhaled once and calmed himself. Min-jae instructed Chai to isolate any line still accepting only physical handshakes, wanting dumb systems. She acknowledged. He told Yuna that the breach was feeding corruption spores into the chamber and ordered her to keep them off him, warning that if the growths reached the lower bus columns, they would lose the reroute. Yuna grinned despite the chaos, considering it a simple assignment, and launched in a blue streak, crashing into the first cluster of crawling black creatures spilling from the breach, her blade flashing in clean arcs of light. Min-jae ran the other way and seized a manual control wheel the size of a truck tire, but it did not move. He discovered it was locked by servo backpressure. He ripped open the housing, jammed a steel alignment rod into the gears, and forced the wheel to turn. Metal shrieked as the wheel turned one notch, then another, and across the chamber, one seal gate slammed shut. The reactor core spiked brighter. Chai called out that the West 2 seal had been closed but pressure surged to the primary ring. Min-jae acknowledged. His display redrew, showing that the fortress had too much power trapped in the wrong loops, trying to maintain systems already lost. He stared at the chamber like a physical blueprint and saw the answer: ugly, dangerous, and necessary. Min-jae explained that they were not stabilizing the original network but cutting out the infected logic entirely and rerouting through the construction bypass lattice. Chai blinked in surprise. He added that the temporary network was never meant to carry live siege load, nor was half the fortress. He pointed rapidly, saying that if he brought Ring 3 offline, bridged the feed columns, and hard-closed the lower breach shutters, the bypass could carry shelter, inner walls, medbay, and command, but everything else would be dropped. Chai listed the sacrifices: outer circulation, non-critical lifts, fabrication, and half the sensor grid. Min-jae confirmed. A support cable snapped overhead with a gunshot crack. Yuna landed beside them, monster blood steaming off her blade, reporting that the breach was growing. The rupture widened as bone-plated crawlers poured through, and behind them, something larger pushed at the opening. Min-jae asked for 3 minutes. Yuna's expression hardened, and she dashed back into the storm. Min-jae climbed down to the lower catwalks 2 levels at a time, heat battering him and warning glyphs flashing over every panel. He reached an old switchboard stamped temporary load transfer, authorized engineering only, the system everyone thought was scrap. His class interface loomed around his hand, structural/mana integration. He slammed his palm into the board, and blue geometry raced through the panel, identifying intact channels hidden in the walls. A red conduit burst above him, raining blazing mana vapor. He threw himself aside, shoulder smashing into the grating, pain lancing through his arm. Che's voice crackled over comms, warning that the primary ring was at 93% and that if it overloaded, the chamber would vent inward. Min-jae acknowledged. He tore open a junction box with a crowbar. Inside, 6 cable bundles pulsed with different colors and frequencies. His eyes tracked them instantly. False feedback, decoy return, infected relay, live line, deadline, and manual carrier. He ripped out 3 with his bare hands. The whole chamber dimmed, then bucked violently. The system announced critical load transfer in progress, but that manual authorization was incomplete. Min-jae completed it by driving a forged coupling bar from his belt kit across 2 copper mana rails. Blue light exploded over his face. The bypass lattice ignited through the fortress schematic. One by one, sections of the map returned in a new color. Shelters, inner gates, medical, command, and core pumps, alive. But the west breach shutters remained dead. The grotesque siege organism behind the crawler swarm finally forced itself through the wall. It was half-broken machine and half-dungeon flesh, dragging itself on hooked limbs, its maw opening with relay tags and human metal embedded in its throat. Yuna shouted Min-jae's name and collided with the creature mid-lunge, but even she was driven backward across the catwalk, boots carving sparks. The creature slammed a forelimb into a support column, tilting the lower platform. Min-jae immediately recognized the final problem. The breach could no longer be sealed electronically because the shutter track was warped. It had to be closed manually at the chamber itself. He looked at the massive emergency crank beside the broken wall, already half swallowed by black growth. It was too far from Yuna and too exposed for anyone else to reach in time. He ran toward it despite Che's warning over comms not to. The chamber shook around him as red emergency lights strobed through steam and dust. Black dungeon growth crawled over cracked concrete. The warped breach shutter hung half open over a torn wall, beyond which a tunnel vomited heat and shrieking crawler shapes. The whole chamber trembled. At the end of a narrow maintenance bridge above spinning coolant channels, the giant emergency crank waited. Chai warned that the track was twisted and forcing it manually could rip the whole spindle apart. Kong Min-jae did not slow. His chest rig was scorched, the person's charm clipped to it flickering in the red light. He decided that if he did not act, the chamber would die first. Behind him, Seo Yuna planted herself in the breach lane, blade low, silver-white aura flaring as crawlers poured through the warped opening. She vanished forward, silver arcs tearing through the first rank, black blood spraying across hot pipes and concrete. Min-jae braced himself and turned the wheel. Nothing moved. He studied the bent track, the seize bearing, and the offset rail. Panic never touched his face, only calculation. He ordered Chai to provide pressure from coolant line 3 at 30% and to cut it exactly when he said. Chai hesitated, warning that the line fed the pump jacket, but Min-jae insisted that 3 seconds would not kill it and that a wrong guess would snap the wheel from his arms. Chai swallowed and slammed commands into her portable panel. The damaged system responded in ragged pulses. She put line 3 on standby. Yuna drove deeper into the breach lane, smashing a larger beast into the wall, but more bodies pressed behind it. Too many. Min-jae placed one hand on the wheel and the other on the spindle housing, feeling the vibration through the steel like a pulse. Coolant pressure hissed through the jacket line as the warped assembly shuddered, metal contracting unevenly. When Min-jae cut the pressure, it died down. He turned the wheel again, and this time it moved. The shutter dragged a centimeter, then another, while the chamber groaned. Chai exclaimed that it was working, but Min-jae corrected her, saying it was dying slower. A roar shook the breach as a siege-type chimera forced itself into the opening, its plated forelimbs crushing crawlers beneath it. The creature was too large for the corridor but still pushed forward, its bone hooks tearing the concrete wider. Yuna skidded back, blood running from her temple, yet she smiled. She asked Min-jae if the room had one more trick. Min-jae looked up as support maps overlaid his vision, beams, service ribs, gantries, counterweight rails, and coolant channels. This chamber was built to survive failure, and it could be commanded to kill. His breathing slowed, and then he smiled. He activated the Fortress Combat mode by slamming his wrist console against the emergency panel. In the secondary command relay, dark screens relit in jagged sectors as Professor Che's bypass lattice spread across the fortress schematic. A new line appeared, authorizing Foundation Combat mode under Engineering Class Kong Min-jae. Director Han stared in disbelief, realizing Min-jae had hidden another protocol. Static cracked before Min-jae's voice filled the room, harsh and steady. He announced that Fortress Combat mode was now active, corridors were no longer transit spaces, walls no longer cover, and every marked structural member was now a weaponized asset. Silence fell, then every operator straightened. Min-jae ordered manual teams to clear yellow-striped lanes immediately and hunters to drive hostiles into red geometry, warning them not to stand under numbered beams. In inner corridor J12, Park De-yoon and Iron Fong held a narrowing passage against hounds and blade-limbed humanoids. The lights shifted from red to white grid lines projected across floor, wall, and ceiling like a blueprint blueprint wrapped around reality. Diyun began to question the change, but the corridor answered as support columns rotated with hydraulic screams, shells splitting open into spikejacks. The walls slid inward half a meter, crushing, skewering, and pinning the monsters trapped in the center. Iron Fong's heavy gunner laughed, remarking that the building was fighting. Diyun grinned as he kicked a hound into a glowing red square, triggering a ceiling beam to drop like a guillotine. He acknowledged that the chief had finally stopped being polite. Back in load control, the siege chimera lunged. Min-jae never looked up from the panel and ordered chamber Rib 7 to release laterally. A support beam above the breach blew free on emergency bolts and swung like a battering ram, slamming into the chimera's skull and driving it against the shattered wall. Yuna's eyes widened briefly before she sprinted up the moving beam and leapt to drive her blade through the exposed seam in the chimera's neck. The creature crashed into the coolant channel below, steam erupting as the shutter dropped another meter. Yuna noted that Min-jae had turned support beams into hammers. Min-jae replied that they had always been hammers, they just needed the right target. Across the fortress, combat mode unfolded. On a ramp corridor, stair flights split into cascading kill steps, sending monsters tumbling into thrusting steel rails. In supply artery E4, overhead pipe racks detached in sequence, herding enemies into flechette fire from hidden inspection ports. Near the shelter lanes, blast partitions opened and shut like jaws, isolating groups so hunter teams could eliminate them before being overrun. In maintenance shaft C7, walls accordion folded inward while the floor tilted, feeding monsters into a spinning breaker trench lit blue-white with mana current. In the west transit hall, reinforcement fins unfolded into rotating blade veins that shredded crawler swarms trying to bypass floor traps. The fortress no longer resembled a base. It looked like a machine with muscles. Min-jae explained over comms that a wall was just stored force, a corridor was guided movement, and a support frame was potential energy waiting for permission. Operators relayed updates in stunned voices, reporting that Sector 8's kill efficiency had doubled, then tripled, with structural response predicting enemy clustering before contact. Director Han observed dead zones becoming kill zones in sequence and realized that Min-jae had built fallback architecture into the fortress's bones. Chai, pale and sweating at her terminal, clarified that it was not fallback but intent. Every failure state was designed to become directional violence. In the inner atrium spine, a huge enemy wave broke through an interior barrier but stopped as vertical support cables snapped free and whipped downward in synchronized, crackling arcs, lashing through the mass like electrified steel serpents. Yuna landed on a balcony above, breathing hard, awe briefly overtaking her battle focus. She called Min.